Hello again, degenerates, degeneritas, and degenerati, and welcome back to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 314, Volkanovski versus Lopes, live from Miami, Florida, the birthplace of MMA Rax and the MMA RAXPOD. And we're throwing it back to classic mode for the RAXPOD today. If you're one of the handful of listeners that were tuning into this show during 2023, you will recall that before I showed my face last year on camera, I was mostly just doing a time lapse for the background of the view from my apartment in Miami, looking over Biscayne Bay. And so I recorded a few different time lapses for that I sped up and would just kind of use as the placeholder for talking about these fights. I figured, that's probably about as entertaining to look at as what some of these other content providers, not necessarily the MMA space, but you'll tune into like a podcast clip on YouTube or something and someone will have superimposed like gameplay from like Subway Surfer or something, and it's like, you know what, I'm not going to do that, but I also don't want to show my face quite yet, so I think I could still give out something somewhat interesting. But this was for the first year or so of the show. This is mostly what people were looking at, and I figured given that it is in Miami, it'd be appropriate to throw it back to one of the more scenic sunrises I recorded from my my roost in Biscayne Bay back when I was there about a year ago. Moved out in June of last year and have since relocated. Hopefully, ideally, would like to get back to South Florida at some point, but for now I am parked a bit further north, working for a Fortune 500 company as an editor and a writer. So that has been occupying a decent amount of my time, so thank you for your patience with me. Please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube and X if you haven't already. I'm about 30 followers away from 2K on Twitter, and the goal would be to hit that before I hit my 3-year anniversary since starting MMA Rax back in 2022, end of May of 2022, the last day of May of 2022. So quite a card coming up. I've got a lot of things to say about the current state of the UFC and MMA in general, because there's been some crazy stuff flying around this week relative to GFL canceling its first 2 events, the PFL CEO putting his foot in his mouth, just a whole bunch of other things. A lot of morale is at the lowest point, I think, for the UFC as a product since I started doing this. That's not just me having sour grapes about how the year has started. That's just the reality of the current situation. And I will be getting into a little bit of that as we get to the more star-studded matchups further up in this card. But for now, we've got 13 fights to get through. I believe I have 11 or 10. I think 10, maybe 11. I think 11 fights that I've actually put out picks for this week, and I do want to discuss all of them. I will say, I think last show I finally did a good job of speeding things up a bit. The first couple of fights on the card, I went a little bit longer than I planned on. But I think I did a pretty good job of keeping things at under 10 minutes for most of the breakdowns outside of the co-main event or the main event. So in the interest of time, I am going to be trying to keep this pretty expedited. So, don't expect anything too outlandish or ambitious. Now looking at it again, I believe I've got 10 fights that I've actually put out picks for, and 3 have been stayaways. So not going to have much to say about the stayaways other than why I think it's probably well advised to stay off. And this will be, I got a couple women's MMA fights to break down, and I'll tell you up front that I did do, out of all the matchups on this card, the one that I taped the most aggressively was Jandiroba versus Xiaonan. So I'll probably have the most detailed breakdown of that out of all of these, but I feel like I've got a pretty good handle on all of these fighters at this point, not named Yair Rodriguez. So I look forward to talking about all this stuff. Thank you very much for tuning in. And without further ado, let's get started here right away with Nora Cornolle and Hailey Cowan. Cornolle enters 8-2, last having appeared at UFC Fight Night Moicano Saint-Denis in Paris last year, where she lost a split decision to Jacqueline Cavalcanti that probably should not have been a split decision. Then there's a couple of those in the case of Cavalcanti on her record in the UFC at this point. Most people did not believe that Josiane Nunes should have gotten the decision on one judge's scorecard against her, nor do they believe that was the case for Nora Cornolle. So probably should have had an outright loss to her on her record, which would have been the second on her record. Her MMA debut in 2021 was actually, or in Cornolle's MMA debut was against Cavalcanti, which she also lost a 3-round decision. So both losses on her record, made up by Jackie Cavalcanti. She did beat Jocelyn Edwards in her debut, which is a win that has aged, I'm not going to say like fabulously, but at least somewhat well. I mean, she's 1-1 since, and the fighter she lost to was Ain Perez. And Nunes has more than a few Edwards rather has more than a few fights under her belt in the UFC at this point. So pretty decent win for Cornolle. And then she beat Melissa Mullins by knockout in April of last year prior to that split against Cavalcanti in Paris, which again was a bit of a product of hometown cooking. Meanwhile, Hailey Cowan has not fought for 2 years at this point. Her last appearance was April 29th, 2023, back when I was living in the apartment that has the view that you're currently looking at if you're tuning into this on YouTube. Of course what am I saying? You're either tuning into this on YouTube or X. In either case, the video is up, but you've probably got it on in the background. At least I would hope so, unless you are very, very stimulated by the time lapse. In any event, she did get a split decision win on Contender Series against Claudia Leite, and that was in August of 2022, and then had quite a layoff before she lost a unanimous decision in the Apex to Jamie Lynn Horth, who many would argue is one of the current worst fighters on the roster outright. Lost a unanimous decision at Fight Night Covington Buckley to Miranda Maverick, and had 2 split decisions on her record prior to that, one of which she dropped to Veronica Hardy, the other of which she won over Ivana Petrovic. But she did beat Hailey Cowan in her debut in the UFC, which at the time she was undefeated. So not not a great result to be coming off of when you're on a 2-year layoff. And I've heard a lot of people this week saying that they are optimistic about Cowan's ability to perform in this fight because she grades out as the much better athlete than Cornolle. And I can understand that. But at the same time, if you're mostly leaning on athleticism as opposed to technique or experience, if you haven't fought in 2 years, particularly when you've skipped 2 years of your prime, when you're now 33 years old and haven't fought since you are a couple months off of your 31st birthday 2 years ago, that's a big concern. And that's going to be a big theme of a lot of the breakdowns on this card tonight, is why ring rust is something that you really can't discount, or at least should discount at your own peril. I mean, several fighters will tell you, even at the highest that have achieved championship status, will tell you how much those long layoffs can affect them, not only in the fight overall, but particularly early on in fights in terms of kind of getting themselves going. So I'm very skeptical of Hailey Cowan's ability to start fast in this fight. Both of these women are fairly even in terms of their success going the distance. Again, Cornolle's, both of her losses have been against probably the best fighter that she's faced in Jacqueline Cavalcanti. But again, that win she had over Jocelyn Edwards, in which she conceded multiple takedowns to Jocelyn Edwards, she was still able to get the unanimous decision win. And I think that bodes well for the kind of success she can have here against Cowan. Cornolle sweeps all of the striking stats, and I'm still building my set of women's MMA fighters in terms of their UFC performance data. So I don't have an average yet, a statistically significant average of what the women's stats are relative to the men's yet. But I can tell you that for the men's average on a statistically significant basis, the average striking defense for a UFC male, regardless of weight class, is around 51%. So defending a little over more than 1 in 2 of the incoming strikes that they receive. Hailey Cowan's across 2 UFC appearances, one of which, again, was against the aforementioned Jabelin Horth, the other of which was a split decision win on Contender Series. Hailey Cowan's significant striking defense is 34%. So she's absorbing 2 in every 3 of the significant strikes that come her way. That is a recipe for disaster against someone that has had much more striking success like Cornolle has had. So barring Cowan, starting fast and being able to take advantage of Cornolle's takedown defense, which isn't all world by any means and is probably, even below average by UFC standards, but not outwardly horrible or anything. If this fight goes to the floor, you would fully expect Cowan to be the one controlling it. That being said, I don't expect her to be able to effectively implement her game plan for a full 15 minutes just because that layoff has been so extreme for her. And you have to wonder, I know that it's been said that she's dealt with some injuries during that absence, but you just have to wonder what the ability to continue her career at this stage looks like, even if she has suffered that, given how much time she spent away during her prime. So I'm picking Cornolle here with pretty big confidence. I will say that she gets a 29-28 decision in which she outstrikes for 2 rounds, perhaps the opening 2 rounds, and then lets off the gas a little bit late, recognizing that she's banked the first 2 rounds and just needs to avoid overexerting herself to get a decision win. Maybe Cowan finally, shakes off the ring rust late and is able to secure a takedown that wins her the final round, but doesn't really do much for her in terms of actually getting the final result. Cornolle's never been finished. If this does go to the ground, I would think that she's going to be able to fend off any submission attempts from a fighter that frankly isn't even the best fighter in the UFC that she will have faced as a ground threat. I would still give that to Jocelyn Edwards. So, given the fact that Cornolle has faced fighters that offer similar strengths opposite her weaknesses and come out victorious, and given that Cowan has faced arguably worse fighters than Cornolle that have similar areas of success to what Cornolle does and lost 2 years ago, which was her last appearance, I feel like Cornolle is a pretty obvious pick here. It would be, if these two had identical layoffs, it would be a little different, but that just isn't the case. So give me Cornolle to win by 29-28 unanimous decision in which she banks the first 2 rounds, but I won't be surprised if this is a 30-27 or if this ends up being a little bit closer of a fight that perhaps goes to a split. But I do feel pretty confident that she's going to bank at least 2 of the rounds and get a unanimous decision here to start out the night. And that this kind of feels like a spot where the UFC is trying to get a bounce-back result for a French fighter that they can put on the inevitable French card later this year to give her a little bit of a boost and buzz going into that. So, Cornolle 29-28. The next fight is Marco Tulio and Tresean Gore. Tulio enters 13-1, having last fought in January of this year at the first fight night of the year, Darren Rebus 2, in which he gave Ihor Potieria his walking papers at long last from the UFC, knocking him out in the first round. Conversely, Tresean Gore enters 6-2. Last fought in November of last year at the Apex Fight Night Magni Prates. I believe that was Apex 100, in fact. And I also think that was the first fight of the night in which he submitted Mackenzie Dern's ex-boyfriend. I think ex-boyfriend, maybe even ex-husband. Not important. Antonio Trocoli's not very good, and he got defeated by Gore in the same exact fashion that Gore's previous opponent, Josh Fremd, did, suffering very crude standing guillotine. Credit to Gore for being able to, get 2 UFC finishes under his belt with that. The one against Fremd in particular was really nasty. I mean, I don't even think, like, if memory serves, Fremd was kind of like in a reversed or upside down position from where it would normally be applied, or perhaps he just had his neck twisted that much by what Gore was able to apply there. It was a particularly brutal finish. The Trocoli one was more just kind of silly just because of the visual that Trocoli was so much bigger than him. And, he just kind of fell right into what would have been the most obvious technique for Gore to beat him with, given his most recent result. I do think that the odds here are kind of extreme. It seems like Marco Tulio is staying within that 300 range. I do think that that's a little bit disrespectful to the power that Gore is throwing back here, given that Tulio has been knocked out before. His only career loss was his 5th ever career fight in 2018, in which he was knocked out in the second round. So a little bit of a similar concern here relative to a guy like Mauricio Rufy, in terms of you see a lot of knockout wins, and in the case of Tulio, you see a lot of you see 3 wins by decision as well in all 3 of his fights that have gone the distance, compared to a guy like Rufy, who prior to the UFC had never gone the distance at all, but still people kind of writing off that one KO loss as an anomaly, when it's something that you're probably going to have to take into account at some point once the guy gets a level up in competition. But I'm not quite sure that that's Gore here. I mean, we're talking about a guy in Tulio that almost has double the overall MMA experience that Gore does, even though nearly 2/3 of Gore's career fights have come in the Ultimate Fighter and in the UFC. So you can make the argument that Gore's fought the better brand of competition, which I don't think is outrageous at all. That being said, one thing I do think is interesting here is that Tulio kind of joked going into this fight that, he joked on Contender Series when he beat Mateo Duclos, who's like a 6'5", enormous middleweight. He made the joke that his nickname perhaps should be something like, they should start calling him the Giant Killer, because he fought 2 enormous middleweights on Contender Series and then fought a guy in Potiera who had originally been competing at light heavyweight before moving down to middleweight during his UFC run. And it's not like Tulio's super big for middleweight himself. He's just 6 foot. And now he's getting someone in Gore who has basically the same size that he is. So he's actually getting, in terms of, daunting length disadvantages or anything he may have been giving up previously, he doesn't have to worry about that. So I'm sure that's probably a relief to him in some respects. The other thing too here is that, I mean, the knockout loss to Cody Brundage has not aged well at all for Tresean Gore. It's one of the big reasons I've been skeptical of him in subsequent fights. I did pick him, I think I had him graded to win to beat Fremd, but I wasn't confident in it, and so I hedged on the under, and thankfully that ended up hitting the under 1.5 rounds, because Gore's guillotine came in the first minute of the second round. But I did fade him against Trocoli just because, thinking that Trocoli was going to fight much smarter and take advantage of his size. And obviously, it's one thing to have athleticism and size and reach It's another thing to know how to implement that correctly in your pursuit of victory, and Trocoli did pretty much the opposite of that. So I do think that Tulio, I don't know what his ceiling in the UFC is, but I would think that he's at least going to be able to consistently handle, these lower tier opponents at middleweight in a pretty consistent fashion to the way that he did Potiera last time out when he was priced, I think, somewhere up near 400. So I don't feel comfortable playing him at this price, which is why I've advocated just staying away. I actually pretty much got this fight graded dead even for all the bad things that I've said about Gore relative to how much I've propped up Tulio here. But I do expect Tulio to kind of start pulling away as this fight, draws out further. Gore has not done very well going the distance in his MMA career. He won his debut by split decision, and then his only other fight that's gone the distance, he lost to Brian Battle, a fight that he probably could have won in the Ultimate Fighter finale if he had just kind of dug in a little bit, but Battle just had better cardio and much more consistent output down the stretch, didn't need to necessarily rely as much on moments as Gore did. So I'm going to say Tulio wins by second round knockout, but it wouldn't surprise me if he lands something quick. I will say I still think that Gore probably has the power advantage here in terms of throwing harder between the two, but I don't expect him to be able to capitalize on that, and I think Tulio will do a good job of staying defensively responsible, probably pitter-patter at him with, I don't know if pitter-patter is the right word. Obviously, they're inflicting more damage than that phrase would imply, but I think Tulio probably convincingly wins the first round, just kind of outpointing Gore before, maybe getting some sort of body kick in the second round that, Gore really doesn't react well to, and then Tulio kind of goes in for the kill from there. So give me Marco Tulio to win by second round knockout, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if Gore gets some sort of meme finish here again. I wouldn't play this line at all. The next fight is Mudaerji and Mitch Raposo. Mudaerji enters 16-7, last fought at Fight Night Hernandez Pereira last year, where I faded him against Charles Johnson. Johnson won by unanimous decision, but Mudaerji gave a very good account of himself. Might have been his most encouraging performance in the UFC, honestly, given the level of competition, the fact that he was able to take a round away from Johnson, who I believe was still ranked at the time, finished that year with, that was his fourth win in the UFC last year. I think he was one of only, I think he and Carlos Prates were the only two fighters to do that last year, go 4-0. But Mudaerji looked much improved on the ground. Followed the trend of his Chinese countrywoman, Xiaonan, in going to Team Alpha Male to try and at least mitigate the problems in the ground fighting that he had demonstrated to that point. Submission defense still kind of remains to be seen if there's been an improvement, but Johnson was not able to keep that fight on the ground the times that he did get takedowns. Mudaerji was able to get up. The criticism of Mudaerji had been that he had been somewhat of a dead fish when the fight hit the floor, despite having very good striking previously during his UFC run. So arguably, now that he has emerged from what was a pretty big layoff for him before, has come back now, or he's had two big layoffs really for both of his last fights. He's now looking ideally, hopefully, to be a little bit more active here under the tutelage of Team Alpha Male, as he has just turned 29 in January and hitting what is presumably the prime of his MMA career. Conversely, Mitch Raposo has not fought since UFC 302 last year, when he fought Andre Lima and lost 30-27. Now, if you look at the result, it will tell you it was a split decision, but there is not a soul that watched that fight that scored any of the rounds for Andre Lima outside of one of the short-sighted judges that had the total brain lapse in determining that Raposo somehow won that fight. It was a decision that was panned immediately by the UFC commentary team as soon as it happened, and everybody that was watching the fight that commented on it online agreed that Judge Dave Torelli had absolutely no idea what he was watching. Every single media member scored the fight 30-27 for Lima. There was absolutely no argument whatsoever for Raposo winning any of those rounds. The people that did think Raposo was going to have some sort of success in that fight did so based on the fact that he won the first round against Jake Hadley on Contender Series before getting submitted, went back to the regional scene, won 4 fights in a row, all by finish, and was presumably going to challenge Andre Lima's takedown defense, barring any outright cheating from Lima, which Lima got away with with a garden variety of fouls in that fight, to be fair, which had kind of been his reputation up to that point. It's one of the reasons why Igor Severino, I think that was his name, the guy that bit him, did bite him because of the fence grabbing, which Lima also did in that fight against Raposo. But even if he had had a point docked, he still would have won 29-27 on 2 of the scorecards and gotten the split decision regardless. So a fight that really was not as close as the split decision would indicate. Raposo, again, he was presumably going to have more takedown success in that fight, but really did not even shoot, I don't think, in that fight until it became too late for him. Most people were surprised that he didn't turn to the wrestling earlier on. In fact, he only ended up shooting 2 takedowns in that fight, got one of them, but only got 9 seconds of control time, so was able to do absolutely nothing with the takedown that he did get. Now, the people that are thinking Raposo's going to win this one are banking on the fact that Mudaerji, the old Mudaerji, is going to show up in this fight. And I don't know how you can look at the performance he just had against Charles Johnson. Again, a fight in which I was fading Mudaerji under similar pretenses, and that fight ended up being much closer than I expected because Johnson was not able to exploit what had previously been a very obvious weakness of Mudaerji's. It's very, very encouraging for the outlook of a fighter when they show potential early in their career, and during the years when they can still improve, they recognize where their deficiencies are, and they go to a world-class gym in order to rectify those problems. That I drew the comparison for Mudaerji to Xiaonan because they both went to Team Alpha Male, and in the case of Xiaonan, she went to Team Alpha Male after her loss to, I believe, Carla Esparza, and was able to improve to the point that she mitigated what her deficiencies were on the ground so that she would be in a better position to keep her fights on her terms relative to striking. And that approach allowed her to improve to the point that she was able to get a majority decision win over Mackenzie Dern shortly after making that change. Eventually went on a run to fighting Zhang Weili for a UFC title, and is presumably looking to do so again later on. But the point is, you want to see fighters in terms of ones that you have the most optimistic outlook for going, becoming, if not a contender, then at least potentially ranked within their division one day, one of the top fighters in their division, that they will go to a world-class gym in order to iron out their flaws and become more well-rounded. That is exactly what Mudaerji has done, and it was evident that he had made improvements when he fought Charles Johnson that many had not previously expected. I expect those to show up once again against Mitch Raposo, and I think that given Raposo has had very limited offensive striking success in the UFC so far, at least across his performance against Jake Hadley as well as his performance against Andre Lima, that a guy with atypical size for the division in the form of Mudaerji is going to be able to exploit that. Mudaerji he's going to have an 8-inch reach advantage, So he's going to very much be able to make the most of that if he wants to fight to his strengths and lean on the striking. And I expect him to be in a position where he can outpoint his opponent if he chooses to go that path. That's exactly what I would expect him to do. Not get cute. He's got a very obvious path to victory, and I would expect him to make the most of finding that. We've seen Raposo not necessarily pursue his ideal path to victory when he is presumably overmatched. I do think that there are some advantages for Raposo here relative to just general career attrition. And again, if one of these fighters is going to control the fight on the ground, you would anticipate it would be Raposo. But we saw enough improvements from Mudaerji against Charles Johnson that I don't think Raposo is going to be able to control the fight where he would presumably need to. And the glaring length advantages for Mudaerji here are just so obvious to the point where I feel pretty comfortable picking him to win by unanimous decision. So give me Mudaerji to outpoint Raposo. I'll say he does it for 2 rounds, gets a 29-28. Similar situation to the Cornolle Cowan fight, where perhaps Mudaerji is able to make enough of an impression in the striking to win the first 2 rounds before kind of taking his foot off the gas late. And maybe Raposo scores a takedown at last in the final round, or opts to wrestle too late in the fight, as he did against Andre Lima, and doesn't pursue his ideal path to victory. But Mudaerji has made enough improvements to where he doesn't just lay like a dead fish off his back and allow himself to get submitted. He is able to work back to the fence and get up. And even if Raposo ends up banking some control time and wins the round, he was not able to do so during the first 2 rounds, and Mudaerji is up enough on strikes that he gets a pretty clear 29-28. I will say, just because of, ongoing politics stuff with China, I will be a little bit nervous if this does go to decision relative to giving an American a decision win that he perhaps doesn't otherwise deserve over a Chinese fighter on American soil. But that's getting a little bit too into the weeds of conspiracy with the judging or whatever. In any event, and again, it's not like Raposo is some big prospect that they would want to build up either. I mean, this guy's hardly done anything for the UFC short of appearing on Contender Series and losing to a fighter that has since been released from the promotion and is now with PFL. To me, it feels like, especially because Mudaerji is someone that spent a lot of time at the UFC Performance Institute as well, feels like the company wants to do right by this guy, and that's why they're giving him a bounce-back matchup here in a fight where Mudaerji is probably fighting for his job, but they're giving him a very good opportunity to get a win on his record in order to snap the 3-fight losing streak and bounce back accordingly. So give me Mudaerji to win by unanimous decision. The next fight is Michał, Oleksiejczuk, and Sedriques Dumas. Oleksiejczuk is 19-9, last fought at UFC Abu Dhabi last year, dropping a unanimous decision to Sharabullet Magomedov. Conversely, Sedriques Dumas enters 10-2, fought on the same card last year, was supposed to fight at UFC Saudi Arabia, presumably was not going to be permitted to enter the country due to some visa issue. They got him on the Abu Dhabi card against Dennis Tulio. Dude got cut, I believe, after that loss, and Dumas just kind of wrestled his way to an easy decision win there. If you're a long-time follower of MMA Rax, then you'll recall that Michał Oleksiejczuk inexplicably, not only did he tag MMA Rax in his cornerman photo prior to his fight against Chidi and Jaquani, he also retweeted the parlay that he was a leg in mere hours before competing at UFC Singapore and knocking out Chidi and Jaquani in that fight. I did back Oleksiejczuk as an underdog against Michel Pereira. He was not able to emerge from that one successfully. I did play the under 1.5 at plus odds when he fought Kevin Holland, and that was more successful. And then I did make Shara Magomedov a leg against Mr. Oleksiejczuk, fading him in his last fight. So it's unfortunate that since that incredible sequence of events at UFC Singapore that he's now on a 3-fight losing streak. But I think he's got a very good bounce back spot here. People like to say his ground game overall is bad. I don't necessarily agree with that. Again, this is against Cody Brundage, but he took advantage of Cody Brundage on the ground of that fight pretty well, and his ground and pound has proven to be pretty nasty. I also believe that his fight against Chidi and Jaquani briefly went to the ground, and he was able to avoid anything seriously compromising in that fight too. Although Chidi is typically a fighter himself that doesn't want to be fighting on the ground. In any event, most of the guys that have taken advantage of Oleksiejczuk on the ground have fought much higher level competition and proven much more sophisticated than what we've seen from Sedriques Dumas. That's not to say that Dumas isn't going to have things he can take advantage of in this fight. Obviously, he's going to have less concerning attrition. He is going to have a 5-inch reach advantage. And he is, I think, the only native Floridian on the card here. So there's some people that are assuming that the crowd is going to be cheering for him against Oleksiejczuk. I'm not super confident that that's really what's going to happen. But he isn't the most far-fetched underdog on this card by any means. That being said, one of the things that stood out to me since Oleksiejczuk's fight with Michel Pereira is that he really had not been getting a lot of quality camps. I think he had mostly been training with his brother and probably some of his other friends in Poland in a not very serious gym for most of his UFC run. And after losing to Shara Bullet, he has since gone down to Brazil and done his latest camp at Fighting Nerds alongside his brother. But he's posted several pictures of training with fellow middleweight Caio Baralho in his run-up to this fight. So I think the fact that he's getting, not only is he at the gym that was the MMA Gym of the Year last year, but is a much higher quality camp than he's had at any other point during his UFC run to this point. And you got to consider, too, this is a guy who half of his overall MMA career at this point has been in the UFC. So I think that the experience combined with him getting that quality camp, him being a much more voluminous and powerful striker than what we've seen from Dumas, I think gives him a pretty obvious path to victory here. Dumas has never lost a decision, but I also think that this is a pretty significant step up in competition for him, similar to the way that Ruzaboyev kind of was. I would be curious to see if Ruzaboyev went up to middleweight. I would be curious to see what he would be blind at against Oleksiejczuk. He'd probably be the favorite given all of his submission wins. But in any event, you look at Dumas's schedule. I mean, the guys that he's beaten, first of all, I mean, the loss to Josh Fremd aged horribly, and I backed Dumas as a favorite in that fight. But Cody Brundage fight obviously hasn't aged well, even though he dominated Brundage. And dominated Brundage, frankly, with wrestling in a way that I think many people left a lot of people kind of stunned. Abu Azaitar, who has since been cut. The Ruzaboyev fight was controversial because Dumas pretty clearly got poked in the eye and didn't receive any grace from the judges for it. And that's really what led to the stoppage more than anything else. And then Tulio had an even more obvious lack of a ground game, I think, than what Oleksiejczuk has had here, but had not even established himself as a UFC-level striker to the point that Oleksiejczuk had. I think Tulio's only win in the UFC during his run was over the Night Wolf. I know his name. I know his nickname. I'm forgetting what his name was. Jamie Pickett. That's right. Yeah. And then Tulio lost 4 fights on his way out of the promotion. So I feel pretty good about Oleksiejczuk bouncing back in this spot. Obviously, I'm a little biased because he's one of the fighters that showed MMA Rax love during its infancy. But in any event, give me Oleksiejczuk to win by, I'll say he gets it done. I mean, this is a guy who all but one of his wins in the UFC have been first-round knockouts. I don't see any reason to pick against that trend here because I think he's that much better of a striker than Dumas, both in terms of volume and power. Give me Michał Oleksiejczuk to win by first-round knockout. I think that this will be a very encouraging performance for where he will be going forward. I just hope that he continues to take higher quality camps than what he had been dealing with previously. But I feel very good about Hussar in this spot. I think he bounces back. I would assume that he gets a new UFC contract off this if it's preparing to expire. But he at least avoids getting cut, which I think he'd probably be ripe for the chopping block if he lost to an opponent of this caliber. I hope it doesn't go to a decision because Dumas, might get some hometown love. I don't think he's not from Miami. He's from North Florida, but he's again the only native Floridian on this card. You wonder how much crowd support he's going to get in that sense and how much that's going to sway the judges. But I still feel good about Hussar in this spot. Michał Oleksiejczuk, round 1, TKO. The next fight is Julian Juicy J Erosa and Darren the Damage Elkins. Erosa enters 30-12. Last fought in July of last year at UFC Denver, where he upset Christian Rodriguez as an underdog, winning that by, I believe it was guillotine. He's known for having one of the most ferocious guillotines in the UFC just because of his freakish size for the weight class, which is why it's funny that he fought Sean Woodson in what was, I believe, his third stint with the first fight of his third stint with the UFC. And many people would say that Woodson was winning that fight until he wasn't, and Erosa turned the tables in round 3 and was able to get that submission victory. Conversely, Darren the Damage Elkins, what a fascinating recent run this guy has had. Is 29-11 for his MMA career. Last fought at Hernandez versus Pereira in October of last year. He was an underdog against Daniel Pineda. I faded Pineda in that fight on the basis that Pineda had never won a decision in his MMA career, had a 100% finish rate. Elkins was able to avoid getting blasted in round 1 and won the final 2 rounds outright. Might have gotten a 30-27 upon reflection. I don't think that he did, but I'm pretty confident he won the last 2 rounds, at least on his way to getting a 29-28. And that is exactly what happened. I believe he dropped the first round and then won the last 10 minutes going away to get the upset win as an underdog. He was also an underdog against downtown TJ Brown and got what was I believe the 3rd submission win of his UFC career in that fight as an underdog. And he's pretty much going to be an underdog in all of his fights at this point, although he was, I think, a pretty healthy favorite against Tristan Connolly in April of 2022. So one of the first 3 months that I started doing this. And I remember taking the over in that fight just because I didn't feel good about playing Elkins at such a lofty price tag. I did play him as an underdog against Jonathan Pierce as well. So Elkins, despite his age, is someone that I have really enjoyed playing as an underdog in the past. And conversely, Erosa is someone who I've also enjoyed playing as an underdog quite frequently. I did it against Christian Rodriguez. I did it against Ricardo Ramos. I think I advocated for staying away when he was a favorite against Fernando Padilla. But I did play him as a favorite against Alex Caceres. I did play him as an underdog against Hakeem Dawodu. So I'm 3 for 3 playing him as an underdog. I'm 0-1 playing him as a favorite. And he really does profile as one of these fighters that you love to be on the side of when he's at plus money, But when he's at a price of like minus 400, as he was earlier this week, or in that 300 to 400 range, steep juice on Erosa, you really, really don't want to be playing that. And I got to be honest, like it killed me a couple weeks ago for UFC London when I had Cowie Fernandez graded to beat Guram Kutateladze, and I also had Chris Duncan graded to beat Jordan Vucenic, but I ended up staying away from both of those just because I wasn't necessarily able to chart a path to victory for both of them, even though they both ended up winning. And those would have been two really nice steep underdog hits to have, publicly, or be able to brag about picking publicly. But I was too chicken to play either one just because I couldn't chart a path to victory, even though after doing all the grading and the numbers, I still felt like pretty good about them winning this. And that can happen when, you put your grades in and they're telling you that the underdog should be favored over, or not that the underdog should be favored, but that you think the underdog is going to beat the favorite, but the market doesn't agree with you and the line is somewhere out to, like it is in this case where Erosa was close to a 400 favorite at one point. I've tried to be, obviously had the FOMO with what happened at UFC London relative to Fernandez and Duncan. So, I've tried to be more bold in terms of playing those big underdogs going forward. It's like, you might as well. Who's going to remember if you don't get it right anyway? It's like, if a 300, 400 favorite wins, it's like nobody, anybody that's bragging about that is clueless. You want to, and you're going to miss underdogs in that range anyway. It's more about just having them on the record that, you pick them outright. But the difference here between this matchup where I have Elkins graded to win and the two aforementioned cases at UFC London is I can chart Elkins' path to victory pretty easily here. This guy has more than double the experience Erosa does going the distance. And he, despite his age, is much bit more successful going the distance than Erosa is. Erosa's got several split decision wins on his MMA resume. He's only had one unanimous decision win, I think, in the last 13, 14 years of his MMA career, and it was the Dawodu upset. I'm sorry, no, he did have a unanimous decision win in 2017 prior to his Contender Series appearance against Jamal Emmers. And that was a 5-round decision. So he does have 5-round experience. It's not necessarily that he's got bad cardio here, but he does have a penchant for getting in close fights and losing fights that he's otherwise favored to win and just performing better as an underdog. Darren Elkins is somebody that even at this, he's going to fight to his strengths. And I can understand why, particularly in 2019 when he lost to an opponent like Ryan Hall, that's a horrible loss. The Ricardo Lamas fight, I'm getting him confused with Ricardo Ramos, so I won't, speak on that one too much. The Nate Landwehr fight was interesting because Landwehr, had him, it was one of the bloodiest fights you'll ever see. Go figure, it's a Darren Elkins fight. But Landwehr had him beat up pretty good, and Elkins, I honestly was surprised that fight didn't end up being a split decision because Landwehr slowed down, and over the last 10 minutes, Elkins really built himself back into that fight in a way where it looked like he was probably going to get finished in the first 5 minutes. But, Erosa is not a super heavy hitter, despite the fact that he's going to have the length advantages here, and he can fight a more measured style if he chooses to. He has the tools available to do that. I don't expect him to do that. I expect him to get into more of a brawl as he's accustomed to doing. He has the length and the tools and the striking available to fight and outpoint Elkins in a similar way to what he kind of did against Hakeem Dawodu. I just don't expect him to do that based on what he's more traditionally gotten himself into. And if he's not able to finish Elkins, I wonder where this fight goes given his success going the distance relative to Darren Elkins. Erosa's only knockout win in the UFC was against Nate Landwehr in a fight that many people believe should not have been stopped. And this is another case, too, where Elkins has been knocked out 4 times across his very, very long UFC career, or across his entire MMA career, I should say. He's been knocked out 3 times in the UFC, but the only time he's ever been submitted was in his second fight in the UFC, and that was against Charles Oliveira. So his submission defense has been excellent. Even though there are questions about his chin, I still think the guys that have actually been able to, Erosa has not proven yet that, he's a significant enough knockout threat to where he's going to be able to put a guy like Elkins away with just punches. Maybe it happens with a kick, like what happened with Landwehr, but again, that was what many people consider to be a quick stoppage. And the only guy that's ever submitted Elkins is Charles Oliveira. So if Erosa can't finish this fight in the first 5 minutes, I just have to wonder where it goes. And his takedown defense is pretty average at 58%. Elkins is a guy that always tries to fight to his strengths. And I can see Erosa trying to jump guillotine, Elkins being hip to it and landing a takedown while falling into 3/4 guard, or at least being close to side control to where the guillotine isn't in the right position to finish. And then Erosa's on his back, and Elkins is able to stay ahead on the scrambles and keep the fight on his terms on the floor for the remainder of the round. I think the disrespect on Elkins at this price is crazy. I gotta go with him to win a 29-28 decision here, pretty much similar to exactly what happened with the Daniel Pineda fight, where he's getting a fighter that has much more attrition than he does, shockingly, at this stage of his career, that does not have a lot. Granted, Erosa has more success and experience going the distance than Pineda did, but it's still not great relative to what the average performance from a fighter in that category is. I would think that Elkins understands this, is just going to try to survive the first 5 minutes and then win the next 10 minutes outright with better wrestling and top control position and avoiding any of Erosa's submission attempts. Especially as it gets late, it's harder to submit someone later in the fight than it is earlier, relative to, sweat. And particularly in the case of Elkins, when he starts bleeding and it becomes even more difficult to submit a guy like that. I think Elkins is going to win this 29-28. And I think this is a sleeper for fight of the night, frankly. Apparently there hasn't been a fight of the night bonus in like the last 4 UFC events. I wouldn't be surprised if that changes here. So for my first big underdog of the night, give me Darren the Damage Elkins to spring the upset. And I don't know how many fighters retire on 3-fight winning streaks, but if you're Elkins and you're 40 and you spring this big of an upset on a pay-per-view like this, I would hope he at least gives it some thought in terms of, maybe it's time for me to call it off before this gets even crazier, or before I get a level up in competition that gives me some damage that I'd rather not suffer at this age. But we'll see what he does. Very, very entertaining fighter, even into his late 30s to 40. Atypically entertaining fighter on the ground relative to a lot of the lay and pray stuff that we see lately. But I really think Darren Elkins has a great shot to get a win here. And I'm going to take him to get a 29-28 decision in which he wins the final 10 minutes. The next fight is Chase Hooper and Jim Miller. Hooper enters 15-3-1, last submitted Clay Guida in the first round of his fight at UFC 310. I took the over 1.5 in that one. I thought Guida did a pretty good job of staying out of anything terribly compromising before falling into what I believe was an armbar. I was more worried about the rear naked choke, but yeah, he did end up, despite getting top position, not really breaking away from Hooper and putting himself in a bad position and getting finished in the first round. So that was tough, but I think Hooper was a similar price in that fight to what he is in this one. So he had to hedge on rounds in one direction, and I figured Guida would be a little bit more savvy in the submission defense at this point of his career, and that didn't end up being the case. Hooper is a excellent ground fighter, one of arguably the most entertaining and creative scramblers, the most, I would say, in the UFC. Jim Miller, conversely, enters 38-18. On my show for UFC 309, you may recall that I spoke about how when you've done this long enough, occasionally there are moments where the first time that you look at a line after grading a fight, you just look at something and you instinctively know that this line doesn't make any sense. And that was exactly how I felt about Jim Miller fighting Damon Jackson. I said, I don't understand why Miller isn't favored in this fight. And Miller pretty much dominated all phases of their matchup at 309, jumped guillotine, and got the submission victory, and Damon Jackson promptly retired after that. So I was happy to get the underdog win there after kind of calling my shot on the podcast and saying this line doesn't make sense to me and should really be flipped. Anyway, I don't have a lot to say about this one because I already advocated staying away. Like I said, I'm coming off a situation in which I tried hedging on rounds when Chase Hooper was a big favorite against a fighter in his 40s and got bitten for it. Jim Miller is a fighter that I've really liked and backed in a lot of his matchups. I think I've actually taken him to win in pretty much all of the fights that he has had since... I think I've graded 6 of his fights now to this point, and I made him a leg at UFC 276 against Donald Cerrone. I took him as an underdog against Alex Hernandez. I didn't get to Jesse Butler, I believe, was debuting on short notice, so I didn't pick him, but I remember thinking, like, it's crazy that Miller's only a 220 underdog in this situation. Then he won by knockout in less than 30 seconds. I took him as a favorite against Gabriel Benitez. I took him as an underdog against King Green at UFC 300, and it didn't dissuade me from playing him as an underdog against Damon Jackson. This is a fighter I like a lot. I still think at this stage in his career, this is Hooper's fight to lose, but Hooper at minus 900, how can you play this? There's no reason to get cute with this one. I just avoid it entirely. Sit back and watch. I think I'll quietly be kind of hoping that Miller does a Steve Garcia thing and is able to spark Hooper. I hate that these two have to even fight each other to begin with, especially given the fact that Hooper literally just fought like a 40-year-old UFC veteran in his last appearance. It's like you're really giving him another one on a pay-per-view. Like, can we get this guy a more competitive matchup at lightweight at this point? Like, come on. Especially given the strides that he's demonstrated in the striking against Vyacheslav Borshev. We didn't really see him strike that much against Clay Guida, but Guida wasn't really going to be the guy to test Hooper's striking improvements anyway. He might presumably have to see a little more of it here, but at the same time, I mean, like I said, Hooper is arguably the most creative and entertaining scrambler in the UFC at this point, and uses that to get the fight to his ground and put it on his terms in pretty much any way possible. The guy's only 25 years old, and he's already got 10 UFC appearances. I think that the future is really bright for this guy, particularly now that he's settled into lightweight after moving up from featherweight, put some more weight on his chin, kind of growing more into his frame. I'm really optimistic about what the future holds for Chase Hooper. I hopefully we get better prices on him in the future than this. But again, there's just no reason to bet this here, given how blown out the line has become, and the fact that Miller has pretty decent submission defense, hasn't lost by submission since 2018, and the list of guys that have submitted him in the UFC is Nate Diaz, Michael Chiesa, and Charles Oliveira. Do I believe that Chase Hooper has the potential to become a submission artist on the level of those guys? Absolutely. I don't know if we're at that stage or not yet, because the guy's only 25 years old. And I've spoken about it before on the show, where one of the long-term trends in terms of fighters late in their career, one of the few areas that they can make improvements in, because it's mostly a decision-making thing, is their submission defense. This fight does go to the ground. I would still expect Miller to probably get submitted at some point. I just don't know when it's going to happen. I will err on the side of caution and say that given that Miller was submitted in the second round of 2 of those 3 submission losses, that he'll probably survive a first-round onslaught from Hooper after getting taken down to the ground. But then in the second round, he's still not really able to get much momentum going. The fight eventually finds its way to the floor again, and Hooper's able to capitalize on a brief lapse from Miller and find some sort of submission in the second round. So give me Hooper to win by second-round sub, but it wouldn't surprise me if Miller does something akin to what Steve Garcia does and has a brief moment where he's able to catch Hooper early and get what would arguably be I would think would be the biggest upset of his career. I don't know if Miller's going to make it to UFC 400, but I know he is probably targeting 50 UFC appearances at this point. I would like to see it, but I don't know if the promotion is as keen on seeing it, given the fact that they're giving this guy Chase freaking Hooper as a matchup. But we'll see what happens. The next fight is Virna Jandiroba and Xiaonan. Jandiroba enters 21-3. Her last appearance was at the event that was her namesake against Amanda Lemos at their fight night at the Apex last July. Jandiroba won by second-round submission in that case. Conversely, Xiaonan is 19-4, last fought at UFC Macau against Tabitha Ricci, in which she won a completely one-sided decision on her home soil. As I alluded to earlier in the show, this is the fight that I did the most tape study for on this card. Now, go figure, you would think so, because I just started putting out women's MMA picks this year. And so you would think that my familiarity with the female fighters, at least in a technical capacity, isn't what it is with the male fighters, given how much more time I've spent with them over the last few years. So, yeah, I had to, in terms of picking what graded out as a very close striker versus grappler matchup at a glance, I wanted to see for myself which one of these women, and I mean, this is typically just the way that I look at it on any general matchup basis, is in a close matchup, particularly one that is a striker versus a grappler matchup, which one of the competitors offers more in what is their perceived weaknesses to counteract the strengths of their opponent than vice versa. So as it applies to this matchup, that would be, do you trust Virna Jandiroba's striking more than Xiaonan's ground game, or the other way around? And I came away surprisingly encouraged by a lot of the activity I saw from Jandiroba, and also thinking that although Xiaonan has clearly made strides in terms of improving her overall skill set with Team Alpha Male, there are still vulnerabilities to be exploited by a fighter as sophisticated on the ground as Jandiroba. Xiaonan's ground skills are the reason why that fight with Zhang Weili Zhang Mingyang is a light heavyweight. Zhang Weili, if you'll recall, I mean, that fight was so fascinating because that was the first fight right after Holloway knocked out Gaethje, and everybody wanted to see Hill versus Pereira, and and Zhang Weili was a huge favorite over Xiaonan, and most people were expecting that fight to just be a blowout. And the first round was pretty competitive in the striking up until Zhang Weili took Xiaonan's back and arguably submitted her in the first round of that fight. And it was funny, the replay of the corner cam caught the cut man looking like he was giving some sort of smelling salt to Yan Xiaonan to wake her back up after she very nearly got choked out and nearly had to be helped back to her feet by Jason Herzog. The commentary team had to do a bit of damage control and saying, oh no, he was just sticking his finger in her nose to wake her back up and giving her ice, which is the thing you can do. You can hear the entire exchange between the cornerman and her corner in terms of they woke her back up because it was a main event title fight, and they probably did it with smelling salt. They did something that they probably shouldn't have. It speaks to the spirit of Yan Xiaonan that after nearly getting submitted and then in the second round nearly being finished with strikes on the ground, that she was able to then come back, get a knockdown on Weili in round 3 and put that fight in a 2-1 situation where many people were wondering going into the 4th round, did Weili exhaust herself pursuing the finish over the first couple of rounds to where Xiaonan, after now convincingly winning round 3, has a path to victory in what would be an enormous upset. Very gritty performance from Weili where she dug deep and got those last 2 rounds. But I think that fight ended up much more fascinating than anybody could have expected. And especially given what had preceded it in the featured bout, the BMF title fight, and then also what came after it in terms of Pereira's incredible knockout over Hill in which he waved off Herb Dean. So I came away impressed with Yan Xiaonan, especially because people were making jokes that she was the first fighter in UFC history to lose by knockout, submission, and decision all in the same fight. But I mean, she really showed incredible resolve and spirit after nearly getting 10-8'd in the first 2 rounds and coming back and getting a knockdown on Weili and still hanging tough and getting a round back to where that fight nearly became competitive again in the heat of the moment. So I was impressed with her in that performance. I was impressed with her against Mackenzie Dern, but ultimately I was just more impressed with Virna Jandiroba, because the times where Xiaonan was put on the ground, she really struggled to get back to her feet. She was giving up her back. She was taking a lot of damage, and it just didn't look like that she had the well-rounded game enough to where she would be able to mitigate that against the highest level practitioners in that realm in the sport. And that is what Virna Jandiroba has proven that she is. 2/3 of this woman's wins have been by submission. She's someone that has performed very well going the distance in her fights. All 3 of her losses, granted, are by decision, but at the same time, the 3 women that beat her, and this was something I pointed out when I put the pick out itself this week, all 3 of the women that beat her have some sort of credentialed ground game to their name. Carla Esparza, mostly known for her wrestling, former UFC champion, I believe 2-time champion, if memory serves correctly. Mackenzie Dern, obviously very credentialed grappler. And Amanda Hebus, although not as credentialed as Mackenzie Dern, I believe has a couple submission wins to her name in the UFC, and has good ground game in her own right, and is fairly well-rounded, even though she ended up losing that fight to Mackenzie Dern, and I think made some not too good decisions in that fight, in their rematch at least. But my point is, all three of the women that beat Jandiroba had some sort of effective ground game to where they could mitigate that being her most effective path to winning. Xiaonan does not have that. And Jandiroba, in her fights with Marina Rodriguez and Lupi Godinez and Amanda Lemos, what really impressed me was, even though she was sloppy at some points on the feet, I believe against Godinez, she threw like two spinning back fists without any setups, in which she wasn't even close to in range and didn't even come close to connecting, where it was just like, okay, if you do that, I mean, you're just begging to be taken down, especially if you do it two times as successively as she did, and Godinez just wasn't able to take advantage of it. But what I was still impressed with outside of that, with her on the feet, was that she does a lot of stance switching. She does like just enough with feints and footwork to kind of overload the reads of her opponent to where they're thinking about too many different things, and then she's able to go in for her entry and get the takedown. And then once the fight is, I mean, on the ground, or she has the back, you're just in her world. I mean, she is. A lot of people complain about fighters that pursue that route now. Like, you think about what the big criticism of Torres Finney was from last weekend. It was that the guy, for all the wrestling he did, was doing absolutely no striking while he was getting all this control time. Jandiroba is so good about mixing in little significant strikes in between trying to advance position and stay ahead on the scrambles, throwing in little elbows and hammer fists. She's so good at mixing all of that together while she tries to keep the fight on her terms. And I thought showed really good grit against Godinez in a fight that was 1-1 going into the third, in a fight that she might have been losing for most of the third round before getting to Godinez's back finally in the second half of the round and closing out the round with a pretty deep submission attempt. And then the finish on Amanda Lemos, I mean, in the main event, I think that was a big statement for her in terms of how far she's come against opponents that, again, like before, when she was not able to beat opponents that had, you know, ground credentials that could, if not equal her, at least do somewhat mitigate her impact in that realm. She showed against Amanda Lemos that, you know, she can still submit women that are good in that department. I think Jandiroba has to be the side here. I remember watching her fight against Mackenzie Dern, or maybe it wasn't Mackenzie Dern. No, it was when she was fighting Angela Hill. I remember watching her fight against Angela Hill when I was visiting a friend in Denver, and there was a group of women that were over at another table or another part of the bar from us that had glanced over at the fight as it was happening. And towards the end of the fight, Jandiroba had gotten her head squished into the canvas to where it looked like the head squishing was what caused her eyes to kind of look in opposite directions, as opposed to that, you know, just being, unfortunately, the kind of way that she just looks naturally. And I remember one of them almost screaming and really being like afraid that something had gone horribly wrong with her. And I remember joking to my friend, like, I kind of want to just go over there and explain to her, like, no, she just looks like that all the time. It's okay. But that was coming off of her fight against Amanda Hebus. And I remember thinking, you know, upon learning that she had lost to Hebus and Dern, I thought, God, it must be so frustrating to, you know, have the kind of physical deformity where you know you are being just ripe as a target for bullying and criticism and having to overcome that. And then you find an activity like jiu-jitsu that you can excel at and become one of the best in the world. And then you go into a professional fight and you still end up losing to not just one, but multiple women that are considered to be among the most attractive in the sport. I mean, I feel like a lesser person. It's like not only did I finally find something I thought I was good at, but I just got beat at it by someone who has not had to deal with nearly the amount of scrutiny in physical appearance that I have had to deal with in my life. And I feel like a lesser person probably would have wilted under those circumstances. And she's now on a 4-fight winning streak, 1 fight away from a title shot, if she's able to get the win here. The spirit of this woman and her opponent, Yan Xiaonan, are just so commendable. If this fight doesn't interest you, you're not a true fan of this sport. This is a fascinating fight between two of the best spirits that this women's division has to offer. And I'm so fascinated to see how it plays out. But at the end of the day, given the opponents that have beaten Jandiroba before, the only 3 in her career, I don't see Xiaonan fitting the same pattern as those other 3. And because of that, I think Jandiroba is going to get a 29-28 decision win, similar to the one that she had against Lupi Godinez or Marina Rodriguez, where maybe there's one argument in the striking for Xiaonan to get one of the rounds, but there's 2 rounds where Jandiroba got the fight into her world. Xiaonan wasn't able to get up, and there's just no doubt about who the better fighter was for 10 of the 15 minutes of this one. Unfortunately, I can't imagine either of these women beat Zhang Weili. I thought Tatiana Suarez was going to be the one to do it, and Suarez got absolutely dominated. Zhang Weili is just on another level relative to almost the entire division right now. I don't think that Jandiroba has the. I think Weili is well rounded enough to where if she has to fight Jandiroba again, she's just going to do too good of a job of staying away from the grappling to where Jandiroba is just going to get lit up on the feet. And we've already seen what happens when she's tasked with fighting Xiaonan. Even if she's getting knocked down in that fight, she's doing a good enough job of rallying and getting the fight to the floor to where she's able to make a definitive statement on the ground that she's the better fighter. She's just too well-rounded in all areas for me to believe either one of these women dethrones her as champion. But, man, I'll be rooting for Jandiroba with all my heart to do it. I want nothing but the best for that woman because I know that she's had a tough draw, and you can tell that it just hasn't affected her spirit or her approach to life in any way. I'm so excited for this fight. Give me Jandiroba to win 29-28. I don't know if this is going to be a fight of the night contender. I sure hope it is. But I just need to say it again. If you're not looking forward to this one, you're not an MMA fan, period. The featured prelim of UFC 314 is Sean Woodson and Dan Ige. Woodson enters 13-1-1. Last fought at Fight Night Covington Buckley, the final event of 2024, where he knocked out Fernando Padilla in the first round. I bet Woodson very, very confidently as a parlay leg that night, and he did successfully deliver. Conversely, Dan Ige last fought at UFC 308, where I picked him as an underdog against Lerone Murphy. And frankly, I think he gave a better account of himself and had a more competitive fight against Lerone Murphy than the one that Josh Emmett just had last week, which is, I think, further reflected in the fact that Ige knocked down Murphy in the first round and forced Murphy to turn to his wrestling to win that fight in a way that Emmett did not compel Murphy to do in their most recent outing. At a glance, before I actually did the analysis on any of these, I think that this was probably the fight that I was looking forward to the most on the whole card, because I really like both of these fighters a lot. I don't know what Woodson's ceiling is, but obviously the guy's size for the weight class is anomalous. I mean, you would say that for a guy like Julian Erosa, who he fought previously in his MMA career and still is the only guy that's ever actually beaten him. But Woodson is somehow an inch bigger than, or inch taller than Erosa even is, which is just crazy to think about. Meanwhile, Ige, what can you say about this guy? What can't you say about this guy, man? I mean, what he did at UFC 303, I mean, I've talked about before about guys getting rewarded by the UFC brass for doing company favors. Is there any greater company favor you can recall than waking up the morning of a pay-per-view, not expecting to compete, getting the call that they need people talk about last-minute replacements, and they still end up being like weeks' notice affairs or something. This was a day of notice. The guy woke up in the morning not expecting to fight, and it's one thing to, fill in on day of against, Joe Schmo. This guy was filling in against an opponent that 2 fights after this was going to be fighting for a title on the same card that he's now fighting in this weekend. And took the last round away from the guy. I know there's people that have tried to say like, oh, he had to cut weight twice or whatever. He did not. How much weight did he really cut to get to 165 or whatever the catch weight was that they made for Ige, given the fact that he was waking up day of and hadn't been in camp or anything to take the fight? What Ige did was far more impressive than what Lopes, coming in off of a camp, training for an opponent like Brian Ortega. That guy was ready to fight pretty much anybody within the weight class on earth, given the preparation that he had. Ige woke up not anticipating to get into a fight with a professional championship competitor caliber fighter in Lopes, and still took the last round away from the guy, no questions asked. I mean, this guy, Ige, is a stud. He just is. And he proved, and that company favor he did, I think, is going to pay dividends for him for a long time. Even though he's 33, however long the rest of his career lasts, this is a guy that is in the good graces of the UFC regardless of what happens. And yet he probably could have asked for opponents that would put him in a better position relative to whatever his ambitions are in the UFC. But he keeps taking fights against guys like Lerone Murphy and challenging himself. I mean, the list of guys that he's lost to relative to guys that he's beaten, I want to shout out Marlo Stanfield on Twitter for bringing this stat to my attention, that Ige against unranked opponents in the UFC is 6-1. Now, I think Woodson probably should be ranked. I would imagine he's going to be ranked if he wins this fight, as he's favored to. But I admit, as much as I like Woodson, and I have had pretty good history in terms of evaluating his fights, I'm pretty sure I picked him when he was favored to beat Bazookia. I played the over 2.5 rounds when he fought Charles Jourdain in Canada, and that ended up being the right call because it went to split decision, even though most people feel like Woodson won that fight. I picked him as a favorite against Caceres in a fight that most people think shouldn't have been a 30-27, but I still felt like Woodson did enough to win that. And then I felt very good about him against Padilla, where a lot of people were taking Padilla as an underdog. I've backed him confidently in pretty much every spot he's been in, short of the Jourdain fight. But I also backed him pretty confidently when he fought Luis Saldana at UFC 278. And that's the performance that has me very concerned about this guy's prospects against Dan Ige, because this is a definitive step up in competition for Woodson relative to the rest of the people that he has faced in his UFC career. And Ige, I think, is pretty easily the heaviest hitter he has faced out of all of these guys. Probably the hardest hitter he's faced since he fought Terrence McKinney on the Contender Series in 2019. And, you know, going into the Saldana fight, I thought one of the things that you could rely on was this guy's damage tolerance. And he got knocked down by Saldana twice. Should have lost that fight, but Saldana was just such an unbelievable dumbass that he, instead of finishing the fight on the ground, kneed Woodson on the ground and ended up getting a point deduction instead of a finishing sequence that ended up turning that fight into a split draw when it otherwise could have been a win in multiple different ways for Saldana. Even after blowing the finish, not getting the foul there puts you in a position to where you can still end up winning that fight, I believe, by split decision, if not a majority decision. But instead it went down as a split draw. And Saldana's one of the lower level opponents that Woodson has faced. And you still have to look at that fight and wonder, you know, even though this guy hasn't been knocked out yet, I mean, the list of heavy hitters he's faced in the UFC is not very big. Yusuf Zalal was not the Yusuf Zalal we know now when he beat him by split decision in 2021. I already spoke about how Julian Erosa isn't super heavy-handed for the physical gifts that he has for the weight class. From there, you've got Kyle Bochniak, Colin Anglin, Dennis Bazookia, Jourdain. Jourdain's probably the hardest hitter he's faced, and that fight went to split decision, even though, again, as I said, it probably shouldn't have been a split. Alex Caceres has always been much more of a damager relative to kicks than his punches, and Padilla is a hard hitter, but was also a glass cannon and never really made that fight competitive to begin with and got finished inside of 5 minutes. Dan Ige is a massive step up in competition and a massive step up in punching power relative to the other guys that he's faced. And there's no doubt that Ige is one of the hardest hitters in the division. And it's reflected in the fact that he was able to get a knockdown on Lerone Murphy, where Josh Emmett, the guy that most people would point to as the hardest hitter in the division, didn't achieve that. I was wondering who I was going to favor going into this, given how much I was looking forward to the fight when it was announced. I came away surprised at how much I like this spot for Dan Ige. I don't think that Dan Ige is going to allow Sean Woodson to just point fight for 15 minutes. And even though I think Ige is probably going to need to find a finish earlier as opposed to later, because pretty much all of his knockout wins have come within the first 2 rounds during his UFC run, I still think that this is a bit of a step down in competition relative to the ranked opponent, the firmly established like top 10 opponents this guy has been facing. I mean, this is the list of guys that he's lost to: Lerone Murphy in the UFC, within the last, during this stretch where he's 4-7, which sounds terrible until you consider that he fought Calvin Kattar in 2020. So I believe that was before Kattar had the career-altering fight against Holloway, and it was in fact the last fight that Kattar had before Holloway totally demoralized him. So back when Kattar was at his peak, Korean Zombie, Chan Sung Jung, Josh Emmett, Movsar Evloev, Bryce Mitchell, Diego Lopes, Lerone Murphy. All guys that at various points of their UFC careers have been floating around at least within the top 10, if not flirting with top 5 status in the division. And most of them have at least been in title fights or are going to be in title fights in short order. I don't know if Woodson fits that standard. I think he'll probably end up being a ranked featherweight before it's all said and done, just because it's clear at this point that he presents enough problem to the bottom half of the weight class that he's able to exceed them. But this is still the biggest step up that he's had in competition in his career to this point. And it seems like a little bit of a step down for Ige. And I don't think that he's just going to allow himself to get outpointed for 15 minutes. Give me Dan Ige to win by second round knockout. I think he'll probably spend the first 5 minutes trying to find the most effective way to get inside on Woodson. And Woodson's going to be outpointing him for probably the first 5 minutes. But Ige starts pressing Woodson into the fence. Not in terms of clinching or anything, but just kind of backing him in and keeping the pressure on and mitigating the reach and the length advantages of Woodson coming out of the corner in the second round, cutting off the cage. Once Woodson is moving along the fence as opposed to backing into it, Ige goes in for the kill shot and he puts Woodson out bad. Maybe not bad, but at least gets the knockout win. Give me Dan Ige by second round TKO. The first fight on the main card at UFC 314 is Nikita Krylov and Dominick Reyes. Krylov enters 30-9, last appeared over 2 years ago at Fight Night Jan Dvalishvili, which was a house show at, I'm not sure what casino it was, but it was a UFC event in Las Vegas that wasn't at the T-Mobile Arena or the Apex. It was at some intimate house show setting that, frankly, I wish they would do more of those, especially if they're going to hang around Vegas. I wish they would do more shows like that as opposed to sticking around in the Apex. In any event, Krylov beat Ryan Spann by submission. I played the under in that fight. Felt good about doing that as opposed to leaning on two guys that had proven susceptible to making submission mistakes. Banked on, that was one of the more thrilling, scrambling battles that ends inside of one round that you're ever going to see in the UFC, particularly because it was two light heavyweights, and you don't typically see that kind of fight between two fighters of that size. But Krylov made fewer mistakes and got the better of Spann. Prior to that, got a win over Volkan Oezdemir and another win over Alexander Gustafsson when he was bouncing back from getting submitted by Paul Craig. More on that in a second. Dominick Reyes, conversely, enters 14-4, knocked out Anthony Smith towards the end of round 2 at UFC 310 in a fight where he was heavily favored to win. Smith, it was revealed in the lead up to the fight, had been dealing with the death of his best friend, who was also, I believe, one of, if not his head coach, and kind of had an emotional breakdown on the way to the cage and frankly became an automatic fade once it became clear that he wasn't going to be able to perform effectively that night. And is getting one more fight, shockingly, against Zhang Mingyang. I don't really know why the UFC is trotting him back out there at this point, especially when he's already got a commentary role pretty firmly established with the UFC. In any event, I don't know how much the last performance really told us about whether or not Dominick Reyes is back. Frankly, I picked just Dustin Jacoby to beat him with great confidence given the 3 KO losses he suffered in a row. And I played the under when he came back from a pretty significant layoff to face Ryan Spann, and that fight ended in less than 90 seconds. And that was probably the biggest win of Spann's career, arguably. But I felt pretty good about Jacoby knocking him out. Jacoby ended up representing 2 of the toughest losses that I took last year, both in terms of him not being able to put away Dominick Reyes and actually getting knocked out by Reyes in the first 2 minutes of that fight, and then knocking out Vitor Petrino when Petrino was a minus 2,800 favorite to win inside the final 2 minutes of the third round of that fight. So I've tough break both ways last year on Dustin Jacoby. It's tough to kind of know if Reyes is back yet or not based on those 2 wins, just because the Jacoby fight didn't last very long, and Jacoby had already kind of proven to be chinny at that point. And Anthony Smith was mentally absent, frankly, not for lack of fight IQ or anything, but obviously had a lot going on and just clearly wasn't prepared to deal with a professional combat situation like that, given the loss of his coach in that other fight. So it's tough to know where Reyes is at, but at the same time, it's tough to know where Krylov is at. What I do know is when I started doing this back in 2022, the first 2 events that I did were the fight night between Bobby Green, who was Bobby at the time, not King, and Islam Makhachev, and then UFC 272. And first event was okay. 272 took a lot of underdog shots that didn't end up hitting, including Moicano against Rafael Dos Anjos, which is hilarious in hindsight given how the careers of those 2 have gone since that fight went down. Would you have guessed less than 3 years after that fight took place that the guy that lost would be getting a title shot? It's insane how this sport works out sometimes. In any event, I took the next week off because I was preoccupied during the weekend. It was spring break in Miami, and I had multiple Argentinian women over to my apartment. But so I didn't pay attention to the Apex fight night that was on after that, which I think was Ankalaev versus Thiago Silva or Moises. I think Thiago Moises. I don't know. The guy that ended up going to PFL. That was a light heavyweight. In any event, the following week was UFC London, and I had earlier in that week was the start of March Madness, and I had really, given that I had 2 not great UFC events after putting in a lot of work running the stats, I said, okay, let me do something similar with March Madness and see what I can come up with. And I built, after putting together a model and picking out what stats I wanted to emphasize and doing kind of a similar straight-up comparison thing to what I do with MMA, I put out the worst bracket I have ever done in all the years that I've been doing March Madness picks since I was a teenager. So I said, okay, I need to go back to, what I had been doing well. And I said, I need, I'm confident in my approach with this relative to MMA. If I put the work in, the results will be there. I just have to have confidence in myself and trust my own process. And I had 11 picks for UFC London, and I've spoken about it on the show before. The only pick that I missed that night was the over 1.5 on Ilia Topuria versus Jai Herbert. And I was 90 seconds away from turning $45 into $22,500 on an 11-leg parlay. Brutal miss in hindsight, but I had a bunch of other parlays that night that did cash, and a lot of them were fueled by the one underdog that I picked to win that night. And that underdog was Paul Craig against Nikita Krylov. And I remember watching that fight, or at least doing the tape going in, and I hadn't graded an underdog to win yet, so I had been kind of skeptical. I was like, okay, I'm running all chalk here. That's not necessarily a great sign. But I remember running all the numbers for that fight. And then I remember thinking about the good momentum Paul Craig had and that he had been active. And then I saw that Krylov hadn't been competing for like a year at this point. And I was like, okay, that's kind of a red flag, especially relative to how active Paul Craig has been during the time that he's been away. And then I looked at the Ankalaev fight, which Krylov was, he was an underdog, obviously, against Ankalaev, but he did impress in terms of he won the first round outright against Ankalaev. He just lost the last 10 minutes on his way to losing a unanimous decision. But that was also the first time he had fought in 11 months. And I just remember thinking, like, how much more competitive could he have been if he had fought within the year between when he beat Johnny Walker by unanimous decision and, had fought Ankalaev, taken the first round off. And typically when you see guys coming off of a long layoff, they're not as good at starting fast. It takes them a little bit longer to get going. But in that case, he won the first round and then dropped the last two. And I just remember thinking, if this guy had been more active, could he have been in a better position to beat Ankalaev? Now he's on a similar layoff, and a handful of weeks after or prior to this UFC London event, the Ukraine-Russia war broke out. Now, if you've looked into Krylov's background at all, you can tell that he's in a little bit of a conflicting position because he has fought for most of his career under the Ukrainian banner, but he has since, going into that UFC London event, he actually asked to have the flag removed from the Chyron for that fight. So he didn't fight under a nation against Paul Craig. And going into this fight, you may have heard that he has actually since asked to compete under the Russian banner. So he, I believe, is from the Russian-occupied part of Crimea and actually leans more Russian than Ukraine. But you have to imagine with someone that is from that area that there's obviously a lot of internal conflict just relative to his feelings about the situation in terms of all the people that he knows over there. And obviously he's in a more settled position relative to his own beliefs on that, based on being more confident to fight under that banner this weekend than he was at the time in 2022. But I just remember thinking, between the ring rust that he's carrying here, which he has traditionally not performed well off of such layoffs, and the fact that this recent significant international event has taken place in his neck of the woods, I have to imagine there's so much going on for this guy right now that he's in the headspace where he can make a mistake against a guy like Paul Craig. So I'm going to bank on Paul Craig doing the Paul Craig meme thing again, and I'll bet him at plus money in this spot. Krylov was dominating the fight against Craig, made one mistake, got caught in the triangle, and Craig submitted him. And that was one of the most encouraging early moments that I've had in my career of doing this, was seeing from a mile away, charting it in my own head, that I can see this being the exact victory condition and circumstances under which Paul Craig gets this done. And then it happened contrary to what the market expected based on the implied odds. It made me feel so good about my ability to evaluate this stuff. And it's one of the main reasons why I value ring rust as highly as I do to this day. I didn't talk about it in the breakdown I did for Mudaerji earlier, but I did talk about how ring rust was going to be a theme for this card. when Mudaerji fought Matt Schnell, I, like many people, I mean, that UFC Long Island day was one of the worst days I've had doing this. I think I hit one plus odds play, and every single favorite I bet at chalk that day missed. And one of them was Mudaerji in a fight he pretty clearly won the first round in, got maybe even close to a 10-8, and then just kind of fell apart when Schnell battled back in the second round, and then Schnell submitted him in the same way that a lot of other fighters had done. And I remember looking back at that fight, having such a huge grade on Mudaerji, and thinking, what did I miss here? Like, you know, I would think under most cases I'd probably take Mudaerji to win anyway, but obviously the grade was off enough to the point that he got finished to where I clearly missed something here. So what could it have been? And at that point, even though I had been considering long layoffs significant, I hadn't been weighting them as heavily relative to people on shorter layoffs. And I saw that Schnell, who I had seen compete at UFC 274 against Brandon Royval, actually dropped Brandon Royval in that fight. Not a lot of people remember that, just because Royval ended up getting, reversing Schnell on the ground and ended up winning by, I think, guillotine. He did end up getting a first round submission win, but Schnell gave a pretty good account of himself. He was fighting in immediate wake of, I believe, his mother passing away. And so he was very determined to get a win in her honor and came up short at 274 and took another pretty quick turnaround fight on, I think, barely 3 months, if that. Probably not even that much. I think it was maybe 2.5 months. It was or something along that timeline to fight again at Long Island. I think it was the end of June, and that was like the first week of May. So it was almost even inside of 2 months. I could have the timeline wrong, but in any event, it was inside of 3 months. It was a quick turnaround, whereas Mudaerji hadn't fought in a year and a half. And I remember thinking, okay, even though I accounted for the ring rust here, I clearly did not weigh it as heavily as I should have, and it made a difference in this fight. And look, every fight's a case-by-case basis, but ever since that fight took place, I have more heavily weighted fighters on shorter layoffs that have been in the cage and more active. I've given them much more consideration against fighters that are coming off of long layoffs. It's one of the big reasons that I'm backing Nora Cornolle against Hailey Cowan, is because that's another 2-year layoff you've got where you've got someone that's competed much more recently. And then again here with Dominick Reyes, I mean, even though there's still question marks about whether or not this guy is back, the reality is this guy has competed 2 times more recently than Krylov has within the last 2 years and gotten wins under both circumstances. People are freaking out because they think Reyes looks doughy in his promo photo for this week. I think he looks pretty much the same as he did when he was fighting his last 2 opponents. So I don't know how much stock you can really put into that. I think that there's more questions about Krylov given the layoff, even though he has presumably been training and is in pretty good shape. I think there's still more questions about why this guy has had another massive layoff at this point. I know there's some speculation, I don't even know if it's speculation, but some people have spoken about shoulder injuries and illness and stuff that has caused him to pull out. But reality is this guy has missed 2 years of his prime in a division where, with a little more activity, he presumably could have gotten a title shot. That is a concern to me, especially given how he has fought on similar amounts of ring rust in his past. I don't feel bad at all taking a shot on Reyes and underdog odds here. If the layoffs were equivalent, I would be picking Krylov to win. But this is a pure ring rust fade for me in terms of being optimistic that Reyes can take advantage of the fact that Krylov hasn't been in there and as competitive. It won't shock me if Reyes loses, but I still think that Krylov he's just proven to not be as sharp when he's coming back from this much inactivity relative to actually being in the octagon. And Reyes was in there as recently as the end of 2024. So Krylov's only been knocked out once, and that was against Soa Palalele in the third round of his UFC debut, all the way back in 2013. But I'm going to say Reyes gets it done here by knockout. Give me Dominick Reyes to win by TKO in round 1. I'll say that he's enjoying... I'll say it's similar to the Jacoby fight where Krylov is enjoying some success before he makes one slip up. Reyes is able to capitalize and hurt him, and Krylov just never really recovers all the way, and Reyes kind of just turns up the momentum and is able to put away a Krylov that is just a little bit too slow to get going because he has just spent too much time away from the cage. I know that wasn't the case when he fought Ankalaev, but that was only a 1-year layoff. This is now a 2-year layoff that we're talking about here. And yeah, it's just tough to get a sense of where Krylov is really at this stage in his career, just given the time away. It's tough for both guys, but that only makes me think that this is more of a dog or pass situation. I've only got 2 other underdogs on this card, so I'm willing to take a shot here with Reyes. So give me Reyes by knockout in round 1. The next fight is Jean Silva and Bryce Mitchell. Silva enters 15-2, having just knocked out Melsik Bagdasaryan at the end of February. His 4th knockout win in a row after a doctor stoppage over Drew Dober at UFC Denver last year, a fight that he took only 2 weeks after knocking out Charles Jourdain at UFC 303, up a weight class. The meteoric rise of this guy, John Silva, has been stellar to witness. And I was fortunate enough to bet him as an underdog at UFC 303. Was a key reason I had a big night there last year. And felt pretty good about betting him as a favorite against Drew Dober. And then the Fighting Nerds hype tax came in and made him like a minus 600 favorite against Melsik Bagdasaryan, which unfortunately felt a little unplayable. I think at one point he was favored at like 400 against Bryce Mitchell, but the line is somewhat more evened out since then. Conversely, Bryce Mitchell beat Kron Gracie at UFC 310, but that fight was a joke. Really, I think the UFC was just trying to give Mitchell a bounce-back opponent that had next to no threat of knocking him out, which is reflected in the fact that Gracie does not have a knockout win in his MMA career and has, you want to talk about a guy that you've been able to easily fade based on ring rust. Look no further than Kron Gracie throughout his MMA run. Prior to that, Mitchell suffered what was one of the worst knockouts many people say they have ever seen at UFC 296. In a fight that I picked him to win when he was like a 2.5-1 favorite, because he was fighting an opponent in Josh Emmett that was not only scraping 40 years old at that point, but also had a career UFC takedown defense of something like 46%. For a guy like Mitchell, who is truly a MMA ground fighting savant, an idiot savant, I mean, he was more idiot than savant that night because Emmett effectively perfect gamed Bryce Mitchell, which I don't think anybody saw coming. I don't think Mitchell landed a single strike, total, significant, or otherwise, and he didn't even shoot a takedown attempt. I mean, it was a bewildering approach from Mitchell to not even shoot once within the first 2 minutes. And Emmett, Mitchell had never been knocked out. And I mean, you heard Joe Rogan on the call point out how the guy had been sent into convulsions. I mean, that was a bad knockout. And Mitchell had said plenty of dumb things and done dumber things heading into that matchup. But you also have to recognize that, I mean, the stuff that the guy has done since then has just been, like, even by his standards, abnormally and quite highly suspectly stupid. I mean, for all the dumb things that MMA fighters say to each other and say to the public, if Dana White, who is as much of a free speech advocate as anybody in sports or among the executive level, is willing to go to the media and say what you said was probably the dumbest thing that they've ever heard out of one of their employees, I mean, you've really got to question where that guy is at mentally. Now, I've made the comparison this week between a fight that bit me in the ass last week, which was Joe Anderson Brito and Pat Sabatini. And it's funny because when I made that comparison, I mean, Silva was an even wider favorite than Brito was at the time. And now the line has since settled into where Silva is effectively the same price that Brito is. And the prices continue to even drop because Silva's now down to a minus 200 favorite, which is, it's absolutely crazy to me. I mean, this guy it's no joke. The guy fought Drew Dober on 2 weeks' notice and styled on him. Now, granted, he won the first round, I think, going away. The second round, I actually think Dober was probably close to having the better argument to winning up until Silva landed, I think, 2 different spinning back elbows that totally ripped Dober's face open and ended up stealing the round on that basis. And then obviously the cut was bad enough that the fight got stopped less than 90 seconds into the final round. But again, he took that fight up a weight class against one of the most dangerous action fighters in that division and won convincingly 2 weeks after he knocked out an opponent at featherweight that had never been knocked out in their MMA career prior to that. And then in his most recent fight, less than a month and a half ago, he knocked out another fighter that was supposed to be this prolific kickboxer that had never been knocked out in his own MMA career. 2 of the last 3 wins that Silva has had have been one-punch knockouts against fighters that had never been knocked out previously. This guy's power is no joke. And yes, he is fighting a guy that I think probably has more submission and decision upside than Silva does, which is why I drew the comparison between the main reason why I drew the comparison between Brito and Silva relative to Sabatini and Mitchell. But the key difference here is fight IQ on both sides. Sabatini is a guy that's always going to fight to his strengths. We saw that in how the Brito fight played out. Brito had a very obvious path to victory given Sabatini's chin in the same way that Silva's got an obvious path to victory here relative to Mitchell's chin. But Brito jumped guillotine multiple times and kind of absent-mindedly threw an opening round kick back at Sabatini after he had landed one. And as soon as that kick went out, Sabatini took the opportunity to shoot in, get the fight to the ground, and then, some people were complaining that he didn't finish Brito. I mean, Brito was doing a lot of work to not get put in a compromising submission attempt down there, and Sabatini was at least doing a better job of mixing up ground and pound than what we saw from Torres Finney. So I think people were expecting too much of Sabatini from that performance, frankly, that were upset that he got the decision the way he did. He still ended up getting a 30-26 on one of the judges' scorecards. I was impressed, especially considering I thought Brito was going to knock him out. But Brito didn't fight his most effective path to victory and didn't do what he needed to do to keep the fight on his terms. I do not expect John Silva to do that here, because I think we would have seen something similar against Charles Jourdain, given how much effort Jourdain made to put that fight on the ground. And Silva didn't really entertain it at all. He did concede some takedowns in that fight, but he still stuffed more of the attempts than he gave up, and he was able to get back to his feet in pretty much every instance. Do I think he'll have as much success getting back to his feet against somebody like Bryce Mitchell if he gets taken down as he did against Jourdain? I don't. But I also think that one of the things that has made fighting nerds such an elite gym is that their game plans have been brilliant for all of their mainstay fighters during their meteoric rise. And I can't imagine that that's going to change here. I think really the only thing that I don't like about Silva's fight IQ is that he has a bad habit of, kind of smiling and jawing with his opponents and high-fiving and, some gamesmanship and whatever. I mean, those are the moments that you can come in and get caught. But he won't get caught against a striker of Bryce Mitchell's caliber. I mean, he might get a takedown shot in on him if he's going for a high five and not thinking about the defense, but I don't think that that's necessarily going to lead to a finishing sequence for Bryce Mitchell. And conversely, Bryce Mitchell is not the fight IQ of Sabatini. He just isn't. Sabatini is a guy that will consistently fight to his strengths to a fault because he knows what he's good at and he knows where he's vulnerable. If Bryce Mitchell, if that was the case for him, he would have shot on Josh Emmett. He did not. Instead, he got perfect gamed by Josh Emmett. I don't know how you can look at this and be confident that Mitchell is going to get a win. Does he have the path to victory? He has multiple paths to victory. But the most obvious outcome for this fight here is the guy that has knocked out two of his last three opponents that had never been knocked out in MMA previously uses that power to capitalize on a guy that suffered one of the worst knockouts in recent memory in the UFC only 2 fights ago. And the only guy that has really even been in a position to test his chin since then was a meme fighter with 0 knockout wins. John Silva, to me, here is the obvious side. And this fight is so fascinating because there's so many people, particularly the more white nationalist, if you want to call it, or anti-Zionist perhaps, wing of the UFC MMA fan base kind of emotionally siding with Mitchell here, which is further reflected if you go look at any of the tweets that John Silva has had in the run-up to this fight, particularly the ones in which he's invoking Inglorious Bastards. You see a lot of people echoing a lot of rhetoric that you think would be more appealing to somebody like Bryce. So I think there's a lot of people emotionally betting on Mitchell here, hoping that this has just been hype with John Silva to this point. I don't think it's hype. I think if any, I think at this point, if any of the fighting nerds are still overhyped, it might be Mauricio Rufy, even though he just had one of the most spectacular knockouts in UFC history. I was skeptical enough of Rufy that I advocated for picking James Yantop over him before they ended up moving that fight to a catchweight. And Yantop, even though he has been cut, undeservedly in my opinion, from the UFC since that fight, still made that fight more competitive and took away the final round from Rufy in a way that nobody that was betting on Rufy really expected to happen. So I think that there's still more to be proven with Rufy at this stage up at lightweight than there is with this guy Silva. This guy, you can make a case that this guy is the new hardest hitter in the weight class. If Emmett ends up being done here in pretty short order. I think he's a harder hitter than Dan Ige is. And Ige is, I mean, the guy's nickname is 50K for a reason. I'm picking him to win by knockout earlier on this card. Now that Topuria has moved up to lightweight, and now that, Emmett is 40 and probably on the way out, Silva, this guy's power is no fluke, man. If you were skeptical after the Weston Wilson win, fair enough. But after how this guy beat Jourdain and Bagdasaryan and the circumstances under which he won that Drew Dober fight up a weight class, how can you not love this guy? I think that we're going to see him detonate on Bryce Mitchell. And I think that this, in a time where the UFC is desperate to have new stars blossom, I think this guy has about as much potential as any non-English speaker to become a name among casual fans based on the kind of highlight reel punch knockouts that he's been stringing together. And given the hype and spectacle around this fight relative to the scrutiny that Mitchell has brought upon himself, I think this is a huge opportunity on a pay-per-view main card for Silva to... I think that this is going to be a Star is Born moment for John Silva. Give me John Silva by first round knockout. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what this guy's future is in the division, because the power is, frankly, it's frightening. And that's the same word I would use to describe the last knockout that Bryce Mitchell received. The featured bout at UFC 314 is a fight between former featherweight champ Yair Rodriguez and incoming former three-division Bellator champion Patricio Pitbull Freire. I don't have a lot to say about this fight for two reasons. I'll start with the underdog. Pitbull enters 36-7, last fought in March of last year against Jeremy Kennedy in the Bellator Champion Series, where he won by knockout in, I'm assuming that was a 5-round fight, so it would have been the final minute of the third round as opposed to the final round. But in any event, won by knockout there. Prior to that, fought up at lightweight in a fight where I believe he was supposed to just be cornering his brother at Ryzen, stepped in as a short notice replacement for his brother, but got knocked out on short notice at lightweight against Chihiro Suzuki. So that's one reason to be concerned about Pitbull in this spot, is moving back down to featherweight, having been knocked out up a weight class within his last two appearances, and now being on the wrong side of 35. Now, I said in the tweet that I put out about this that, frankly, I don't really understand where the stats at UFCstats.com are coming in for Pitbull's fights here, given they have numbers available for him, but this is his first fight in the promotion. If you look at his striking differential, it's 2.84 significant strikes landed per minute relative to almost 4.5 absorbed per minute. Now, you would think that a three-division champion at what was, for pretty much all of, I would say, the last decade, maybe more, the second highest caliber MMA promotion in the world, below the UFC, you would think that a champion fighter of that caliber would have a better differential on strikes than one where he's absorbing more punches than he's taking on his way to achieving all that success. It also says that he's landing less than 1 in every 5 of his takedown attempts based on efficiency, but that he has a takedown defense of 94%. I don't really know where the numbers are coming for that. I thought about following up with the UFC data guy that I had a brief exchange with on Twitter last week when I was trying to figure out if Torres Finney was the first fighter to ever win a decision by landing twice as many takedowns as significant strikes, to which the UFC data guy got back. His name's Mike something. And I was appreciative of how quick of a response he gave. Because he pointed out that Olivier Aubin-Mercier, who went on to become multiple-time PFL tournament winner before retiring from MMA, did the same thing, landing only 3 significant strikes in a fight earlier in his UFC career, as opposed to 6 takedowns, getting a decision win, and then still fighting 8 more times in the promotion. But I thought about following up with that guy about where these stats for Pitbull are coming from, given he hasn't actually made any UFC appearances. I don't know if the UFC absorbed one of the earlier promotions that Pitbull fought in prior to 2010, and maybe that's where they came from, and they were perhaps reflecting of only one of his fights prior to Bellator. But he also won all of those fights. He was undefeated until he got to Bellator and lost a split decision in June of 2010. So I would think that he would have struggled to win a fight in which he was, absorbing as many blows as he was relative to what the numbers say he was landing. So I can't trust the numbers that are on UFC stats right now at all relative to what Pitbull's actually capable of. Meanwhile, Yair Rodriguez, who's actually favored to win this fight, is 20-5, and the first event after my sweep at UFC 298 last year, I very nearly had a big night at UFC Mexico City, and I just can't get it right with Yair Rodriguez. And I ended up losing a very big night because I had more confidence in Rodriguez's money line than the over on rounds between Moreno and Royval, which were basically at the same price. And had I hedged on the over, or had I gone with the over as a leg in the main event as opposed to Yair, I would have been in a very good position. And or I would have had an awesome night to follow up my sweep and been in very good position going forward for the rest of the year. But instead I narrowly missed out on that, and it was agonizing to witness because not only did Ortega roll his ankle during the pre-fight the buffer zone, however you want to call it, when Buffer's doing the pre-fight reading of the introductions, I guess, if you want to call it. But then Rodriguez dropped him, got a 10-8 round. How often do you see fighters get 10-8 rounds and then lose by finish? Or just lose outright in the third round? I feel like that was a truly anomalous. It's one thing when a fighter wins a 10-9 in the beginning and then loses, gets dominated the rest of the way, like when Jim Miller fought Bobby Green. But for a fighter to get a 10-8 in the first round and then totally fade as badly as Yair did in his home country against somebody in Ortega that was coming off an enormous layoff, especially considering the performance that Ortega ended up having against Diego Lopes, not even accounting for the stuff that led to the Ige fill-in at UFC 303, It was a truly discouraging, disappointing performance for Rodriguez. And I just haven't been able to get it right when evaluating this guy. I picked him to beat Ortega, or I picked Ortega to beat him at UFC Long Island, and the weird shoulder pop injury happened that ended up being an injury TKO win for Rodriguez. I bet Emmett as an underdog when they fought for the title at 284, the interim title. Rodriguez, according to his own account of the fight, doesn't really remember what happened because Emmett hit him so hard that he nearly knocked him out. Evidently did knock him out. Rodriguez then went on autopilot fighting and ended up getting a submission win and claims he doesn't even remember actually doing it. And then against Volkanovski at UFC 290, another week after I had a sweep, I very nearly had an over 100 unit profit event at that card, largely on the back of picking Duplessis over Robert Whittaker as a plus 300 underdog. But I had the over 4.5 rounds in the Volk fight, and thinking that Yair was going to be durable enough to stretch that out to go the distance, because Volk was like a huge favorite. I think he was something like a 300 or 400 favorite, so I just didn't feel comfortable betting him at that price. And Volk knocked him out toward, like, if Yair had been able to survive to the end of the horn, then maybe it's a little bit different in terms of going back and recovering before the start of the 4th round. But got hit, I don't think it was a body shot. I think he got hit in the head and kind of faded into the fence and then kind of went into nearly the fetal position and got grounded and pounded out by Volkanovski in the final minute of the 3rd round of that fight. So 0 for 3. And then I pick him to beat Ortega. He 10-8s Ortega in the 1st round and then comes back and gets arm triangled by him less than 6 minutes later. So I've been terrible in terms of getting a read on Yair Rodriguez since I started doing this. So if you want my honest opinion, I'd bet Pitbull, because I think Yair fights like enough of a dumbass. Like there's fight IQ concerns I have there that, like, I have less of a read on what Pitbull does wrong in that area. But the guy's obviously a high-level enough performer that the UFC felt comfortable enough bringing him in and making him a featured bout performer on, one of their biggest pay-per-views of the year. So although I'm not surprised to see him as the underdog, I think that you could probably bet him here as the underdog and feel reasonably good about his performance. I would be more confident in Pitbull than I would be in Yair, but I'm also somebody that's been wrong reading Yair in literally all of his fights since I started doing this. I have absolutely no idea what to make of the guy. I can't get an accurate read down on him. So I won't be surprised one way or the other who wins this fight. I'm going to say Pitbull wins a unanimous decision. I could see this being a split. I could see this being a fight of the night if it doesn't end up going to the ground. I think that if, Pitbull would be well served to put it down there, given Yair has been way too comfortable fighting off of his back, as the Ortega fight once again demonstrated. But again, I don't know how you feel super confident one way or the other here. I look forward to watching this one as a fan and just kind of seeing what happens. Finally not having to stress over a Yair Rodriguez result after going 0 for 4 the last 4 times. So I wouldn't bet this, but if you are going to bet it, I would say that this is just a dog or pass situation. Give me Patricio Freire to win, but I won't be surprised if Rodriguez ends up pulling it out. Whatever happens, assuming the main event goes the way I think it's going to go, after all the hoopla at the press conference, just make sure that Rodriguez fights Lopes in Mexico City. We need to get that fight. The co-main event of UFC 314 is Paddy Pimblett and Michael Chandler. Pimblett enters 22-3, last fought at UFC 304 last year against Bobby King Green. That fight was the only fight I missed on that card, and it cost me although I still profited on the event, I only made a handful of units, I think about 4, whereas if that fight had gone over 2.5, as I expected it to, if it had been a pure striking affair, as Bobby Green should have let it remain being before he shot one of the dumbest takedown attempts in UFC history, which makes me wonder what could have possibly motivated him to do such a thing against a fighter the UFC has a vested interest in propping up as a potential star. that fight ended up costing me like a 400 unit profit night, which obviously is like that's one of the best nights that is the second best night I've ever had easily, and the best night that I've had on record if that ends up going through last year. It was agonizing after going 4 for 4, I think, on underdogs at that card, including picking Bilal Muhammad to beat Leon Edwards, to have that be the one that toppled the house of cards. But in any event, still, I think I enjoy Paddy more than most people. I'm still not entirely sold on him. But the guy I'm even less sold on is Michael Chandler. Chandler is 23-9, lost a unanimous decision to Charles Oliveira last time out, where he got his ass kicked pillar to post over the first 20 minutes of that fight, and then got away with, after getting away with fence grabs and eye pokes to start the fight and over the course of the first 20 minutes, once again got away with an eye poke that Charles couldn't immediately recover from, that led to the fight going into a favorable position for Chandler in the final round. And then Chandler unleashed several very obvious strikes to the back of the head that went unpenalized by the referee, affectionately known as No Nonsense Keith Peterson, who allowed all the nonsense to happen in that fight. And that fight reinforced a narrative that I guess had existed prior to the Poirier fight, but really cemented Chandler as being kind of a dirty fighter. And there's some people that will argue that, in this sport, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. And that's a fair point in light of the recent way we've seen the rules enforced, where it seems like you're only really punished if you commit 3 of the same foul in the same fight at this point, that even though you get warned in the back, you're still allotted 2 warnings if both of your fouls appear to be accidental. You've got to commit really like 3 groin kicks before they actually penalize you. Fence grabs almost never get penalized unless they're the most egregious of egregious fouls. And then the same thing with eye pokes. As groin kicks, where most fighters are getting allotted at least 2 of them before they actually get enforced as taking a point away. Now, in the case of the Poirier fight, Chandler committed the very rare infraction, one that frankly I haven't really seen replicated since, of actually fish hooking, in terms of putting the fingers in the mouth of Poirier, I believe, while Poirier was looking for a choke as a way of trying to defend the rear naked choke. And Poirier outright, called him out for it after the result. And Chandler was, trying to accuse Poirier this week in the press run of being a sore winner in wake of that. It's like, no, he called you out for being a dirty fighter. And frankly, everything that you got away with in your rematch with Oliveira kind of reinforces that. Now, I will always have somewhat of a soft spot for Chandler because I was at UFC 274, which means I saw what was probably the best knockout of that year when he soccer kicked Tony Ferguson. That is a memory that will stick with me forever. Relative to it, I've described it before as it being like a bolt of lightning went off in the arena, like basically being the equivalent of when a buzzer beater in an NBA playoff game, except the buzzer beater, you can anticipate it coming because the clock is about to hit 0. In this case, the second round had just started and it caught everybody totally off guard. But the pop from the crowd was identical to what you would get from a game-winning shot in a playoff game. It was spectacular. And so I will always have some level of gratitude to Chandler for that. At the same time, this is a guy that I do consider to be a fairly dirty fighter on the wrong side of his career that waited multiple years for a Conor McGregor payday that never came. And now I have to wonder where he's really at this stage of his career and how much the UFC really feels like it can get out of him at this stage, especially based on the performance he just had against Charles Oliveira. I don't think that you can view this guy as a realistic contender at this stage of his career. And he's fighting a guy in Paddy Pimblett that we not only can infer that the UFC has a very vested interest in the guy becoming a star, but we've already seen them outright screw fighters with not only favorable matchmaking, such as giving him Tony Ferguson while Ferguson is on the obvious decline, such as a guy like Bobby Green, who I believe that was Bobby Green's first fight off of the ridiculous Jalen Turner stoppage. It was not. Green fought at UFC 300, so they actually let Green salvage his stock a bit before putting him against Paddy Pimblett, where Pimblett was finally fighting a guy that was like legitimately a fringe-ranked guy in the division, and Pimblett has since now maneuvered his way into the lightweight rankings, I believe. And most people would tell you that he lost to Jared Gordon, and frankly, I do think that he lost to Jared Gordon. That was one of the most obvious, and I picked Pimblett to win that fight. I thought it was one of the most stone-faced robberies of that year when it happened, and all I could do was just throw back my head and laugh, because I remember how much press run Pimblett did with Dana White and with Barstool Sports in the week leading up to UFC 282, and thinking, if this is a close fight, there is no way that they're going to give it to a guy that is only appreciated by hardcore fans in Jared Gordon than if they were to give it to Paddy Pimblett. I don't see why the case would be any different here if it's a close fight. If you think this is going to be a close decision over 5 rounds, what reason does the UFC have to make sure that that fight goes to Chandler, as opposed to making sure that that goes to Paddy for what Paddy can potentially provide? There's a billboard that I drive by every day on the way to work, but there's a set of them, but I didn't notice that they had put up this billboard until earlier this week. And the timing, I think, is very interesting relative to this being one of the bigger pay-per-views of the year, presumably for the UFC. And it's a UFC billboard and an ad for Amsterdam Vodka, and they've got 4 fighters on that billboard. Think about the recent big stars this promotion has had in years prior that you know are household names among casual fans, and then consider the 4 names that I'm about to give you relative to where they're at in their careers right now that were on this billboard. Rose Namajunas, Sean O'Malley, Charles Oliveira, and Ilia Topuria. None of those fighters currently have a belt. There's a lot of people that don't think Rose Namajunas has a realistic path back to title contention at this point. I'm not sure whether I agree with that or not, but based on how her career development has worked out, and frankly, I mean, like I just said, I was at UFC 274, which means I saw her fight against Esparza, which was the worst title fight, arguably, in UFC history, men's, women's, or otherwise. I don't know whether she's got a realistic path back or not. Sean O'Malley is one of the most obvious candidates in terms of biggest stars among casual sports fans that are in MMA. Or casual MMA, what I'm trying to say is MMA fighters that have the potential to become stars among casual sports fans. I mean, he's already got that to a certain degree, but if you really want to legitimize them to somebody that's not paying attention, you got to have a belt on him. Most people aren't convinced that Merab is losing the belt anytime soon, so it's going to be easier said than done for O'Malley to get back that strap. Charles Oliveira is my hero, but I don't realistically see him beating Islam Makhachev for the belt. And even if Makhachev vacates and goes up to 170 at some point in the near future, Ilia Topuria just moved up to 155. Now, Topuria is undefeated. He's got a belt, or he had a belt that he somewhat unnecessarily vacated, but he doesn't want to go back down to featherweight. But he also did it under the expectation that the UFC was going to give him an immediate title shot against Makhachev at lightweight. And that has yet to be finalized yet. I think that would be an egregious misfire by the UFC to not grant that, given what the expectation communicated from Topuria was. And you probably don't want to make one of your biggest potential stars angry, but the guy is still going to need a belt in order to legitimize himself among casual fans, despite the fact that he knocked out both Volkanovski and was the first guy to knock out Holloway. You still got to put a belt on that guy if you want him to be one of your biggest stars among casual fans in this sport, which is why it was so shocking that he vacated to begin with. So you've got two of those guys presumably fighting for titles in the near future, and then the other two fighters on that billboard are, obviously former champions, but you don't know how soon they're going to be back in title fights, if at all. My point with that is that the UFC is starved for stars right now. Absolutely starved. They need to reinforce any major figures among casual fans that they can. And that's the original reason that they gave Paddy Pimblett the win over Jared Gordon. It's why they've given him the favorable matchmaking throughout his entire UFC run. Why do you think he's getting the shot against Michael Chandler here, as Chandler comes off of probably the biggest letdown performance, even though he was a pretty, not a massive, but a significant underdog to Charles Oliveira, still got outright, no question beat, and could have perhaps even been 50-45 had he not gotten away with illegal activity in the 5th round of that fight. Again, if this is a close decision, I don't see how it goes any way other than for Paddy. Submission upside, you have to imagine, is Pimblett's. Knockout upside, you have to imagine, is Chandler's, but Paddy's also never been knocked out. Most of the people betting Chandler here are expecting Chandler to be the more powerful puncher, and I get that. But we have also seen a pretty consistent pattern from Chandler at this point of him going on to lose fights that he otherwise has the momentum in and probably should win. It's what happened the first time that he fought Charles. The Gaethje fight wasn't a good example of that. The Tony Ferguson fight, a lot of the people, he was like a 300 favorite, I think, in that fight. And most of the people that I was there watching the fight with, a lot of people thought that Tony, that was the most encouraging round he had on his way out of the UFC. And I think at least one judge scored that round for Tony. And I think I think you could have scored it either way, but I think he had a very fair argument for winning that one. So think about, for as washed as Tony looked on the way down, like one of the moments where he looked like he could legitimately still compete with these level fighters was against Michael Chandler. And then Chandler memed him, within 30 seconds of the fight restarting. But for that 5 minutes, Ferguson looked like he still had something left to give. I believe that he took the second round back from Poirier. I think he won at least one of the rounds against Poirier where it was ambiguous going in. Had good momentum to start the third, but then ended up giving up his back and getting submitted. And that was the first time he had ever been submitted in his MMA career. And then against Charles, just got totally outworked in pretty much every realm of the fight for the first 20 minutes of it. Chandler's made a bad habit recently, and I pointed this out in the show I did for UFC 309. He's been giving up his back a lot more than he used to, and I think that Paddy is a grappler of Paddy's caliber is probably going to exploit that. When you account for the fact, additionally, that Pimblett has never been knocked out, as powerful as Chandler is, his trend of letting fights get away from him that he otherwise was winning or should be winning, the age, the amount of time off, And, you know, I talked about promotional incentives here. I'm going to allow me to wander into conspiracy theory land for just a moment here. If you're Michael Chandler and you were anticipating getting this huge payday against Conor McGregor at UFC 303, and then McGregor pulls out a week or two from the fight, and this big windfall of cash and pay-per-view points you were expecting goes out the window, and the UFC had already set aside the money that they were going to pay you to show and potentially win, and they're still making money hand over fist. No pun intended. You held out for 2 years for that. Everybody's expecting you to call out McGregor if you win or lose this fight, just as you called him out after you got dominated by Oliveira in your most recent appearance, the first appearance that you made in 2 years. There's already the speculation that Bobby Green took a dive against Paddy Pimblett, based on the fact that he shot one of the stupidest takedowns ever in a fight where he was arguably winning the striking exchanges. I don't know about arguably, but it felt like the way that fight was going, it felt like Bobby Green was just going to let Paddy kind of do whatever on the feet, and then Bobby was going to turn it up over the last 10 minutes and maybe win a decision. But instead, Bobby didn't capitalize as much on the feet as he perhaps could have, and then shot an ill-advised takedown and ended up getting triangled to death after getting caught in a guillotine briefly prior to that on the way down. There's a lot of people that think Green was paid off in order to do that, to legitimize Paddy as a ranked fighter at lightweight, given the star status that he commands among casual sports fans in the UK and beyond, because of how good his ring skills are and how funny his Scouser accent is and whatever. If you subscribe to that theory, and I don't know whether to believe in it or not, but I don't think it's really a totally ridiculous position to take. What is stopping the UFC from going to Chandler and saying, you were expecting to get all this money. You didn't get it. We still have it. We'll give you what you were expecting, and all you have to do is take a dive. Shoot an ill-advised takedown, just like Bobby Green did. You land 1.5 takedowns for every 3 rounds of your UFC career so far, so people would more expect you to shoot a takedown here than they would Bobby Green even. Put yourself in a position to get easily submitted and tapped out. Just make it look convincing. And let us legitimize this guy on his way up while you're on your way out. You'll get that payday that you were expecting. Because you're not going to fight for a title again after that performance you just had. You're going to be 39 years old 2 weeks after this fight takes place. What is stopping you from doing that? Like, why wouldn't you take that if you're in his position? For pride purposes, that'd be awfully stupid. But then again, this is a guy that for pride purposes called out Conor McGregor after he got 49-46 against Charles Oliveira and has been chasing Conor McGregor, chasing the dragon, so to speak, for more than a little bit now. So maybe that isn't happening. But maybe it is. And given all the shady shit around Paddy Pimblett's career, I don't think that's an angle you can ignore here. I'm not saying that this is going to be an outright rigged result. But I also think that the juice isn't enough on Pimblett here that you would be ill-advised betting against him. Now, if you want to bet against him out of spite and believe in Chandler, you go right ahead. But I think that there's enough concerns about where Chandler is at this stage in his career relative to the vested interest we know the UFC has in Paddy being a star and what Paddy is actually good at relative to what Chandler has struggled with of late. That there's more than a reasonable path to victory for Paddy here, even in a 5-round fight. I'm going to say Paddy becomes the second fighter to submit Michael Chandler. I just think Chandler has been giving up his back too often, and I think Paddy has proven a savvy enough grappler at this point that he will be able to take advantage of that. I'll say Paddy gets a rear naked choke in round 3. Give me Paddy Pimblett by submission. And now we come to the main event. Alexander Volkanovski and Diego Lopes. Volkanovski enters 26-4, although he is 1-3 in his last 4 fights. Prior to that, prior to losing by unanimous decision to Islam Makhachev at UFC 284, in what many consider one of the best fights in MMA history, a fight that some people, perhaps out of spite for Makhachev, scored for Volk even. I thought 48-47 was the pretty clear way to score that. But had been on a 21-fight win streak, I believe, after getting knocked out by Corey Nelson in Australian Fighting Championship 5 in 2013. Ripped off 21 wins in a row, including a trilogy sweep over Max Holloway. His only win since that loss to Makhachev was the fight I talked about earlier at UFC 290 with Yair Rodriguez. Took a fight against Makhachev as a short notice replacement after Oliveira suffered a bad cut, and I believe he was replacing Oliveira in that case. But in any event, got head kicked by Makhachev, and then went back down to featherweight to defend his featherweight belt against Ilia Topuria, and despite a competitive first round, got knocked out by Topuria in the second round of that fight. I faded Volk, wondering when the next time we would ever get Ilia Topuria at underdog odds would come along, and that played into the most recent sweep I've had in my time doing this at UFC 298 last year. Conversely, Diego Lopes is somebody that I was late to get on the train with. Lost to Joe Anderson Brito on Contender Series, which remains one of the most bewildering developments in terms of like a guy winning versus a guy losing on that show, and relative to where their careers are 4 years later that I can think of. Brito obviously just lost 30-26 to Pat Sabatini. Could have been a win streak if he hadn't gotten screwed over against William Gomes at UFC Paris last year. But in any event, Lopes, obviously after losing on Contender Series, did not get a contract offer. Lost his fight after that, actually, in what was a 5-round affair. Hit the second 5-round fight of his career in which he lost a split decision, but then picked up a pair of knockout wins after that in 2022. Made a short notice debut against Movsar Evloev at UFC 288, and gave a fairly good account of himself, despite the fact that I think at least one judge scored that fight 30-27, but most people would argue that Lopes at least won the last round, given the fight ended in a highly compromising, I believe, a knee bar attempt that Evloev got stuck in. But Evloev had been hip to most of the submissions for most of that part in that fight, and Lopes had proven a bit too willing to fight off of his back. So because the first 2 fights of his career tracked by the UFC stats were both losses, obviously the numbers really didn't reflect how good this guy would end up becoming over the next few years. I did pick Lopes as a favorite and made him a leg even when he fought Gavin Tucker. A big reason that I did that was because Tucker was, I believe, on a multiple-year layoff going into that fight, whereas Lopes had competed a few months prior at UFC 288 on short notice. So that was another example of very appropriate amount of time between fights against someone that had taken a super extended leave of absence like Gavin Tucker did. But I also picked Pat Sabatini in what was close to a pick'em to beat Diego Lopes, and Lopes knocked him out in 90 seconds. And I remember very frustratingly typing out last weekend that what Pat Sabatini just did to Joe Anderson Brito is what the people that bet Pat Sabatini against Diego Lopes expected him to do against Lopes. And that didn't come to pass. And somebody said if Sabatini fights Lopes, 9 times out of 10, Sabatini does what he did to Brito to Lopes. I don't know how true that is based on how things kind of unfolded in their career since then. But still, extremely frustrating to see Sabatini do what you would expect under that circumstance. And Brito doesn't end up getting the knockout, but a guy like Diego Lopes does. I still wasn't willing to buy into the hype when he fought Sadiq Youssef. The Youssef performance was obviously pretty impressive, even though I don't necessarily think the win has aged well, just because Youssef hasn't really been active and his career has kind of derailed. I mean, Youssef literally has not fought since UFC 300 last year. And he was coming off of a main event with Edson Barboza in which he had, I believe, won at least the first 2 rounds, if not gotten a 10-8 in the opening round, and then just kind of totally fell apart and let Barboza come all the way back on his way to winning a unanimous decision in that fight going away. It was a very discouraging performance, so I don't think it was the best win for Lopes's resume. I picked Ortega to upset Lopes at UFC 303. Obviously, Ortega misses weight and then becomes sick and pulls out entirely. Lopes gets matched day of with Dan Ige to kind of salvage an event that had already had a truly hilarious amount of cancellations and rebookings. He was like a 300 favorite, I think, at least against Dan Ige. Won the first 2 rounds, I think, fairly convincingly. But then whether he took his foot off the gas or just got tired for whatever reason, Ige took the last round off of him convincingly, even though he lost. I felt like Ige earned more respect coming out of that fight than Lopes, but there's so many people that were already on the Lopes hype train at that point that they were still willing to say, oh, this guy took this fight day of just as much as Ige does, so look at how good he is. All right, whatever. Finally, I picked Lopes against Ortega at UFC 306. And I wasn't super confident because I was worried about what would happen if Lopes, as he had demonstrated against Evloev and Joe Anderson Brito, if this guy is too willing to fight off, and in the final round against Dan Ige, if this guy is too content to fight off of his back, as he has consistently demonstrated in these fights that don't end in the first round during his UFC run, a guy like Ortega is going to feast off of that. But Ortega never got the fight to the ground. He got knocked down within the first minute or so. And that fight became a 15-minute striking affair. And if you told me that the fight between Lopes and Ortega was going to be 15 minutes of striking, I would have bet the moon on Diego Lopes, even though I had already picked him outright to win anyway. I just expected at least some portion of that fight to take place on the ground, given both of those guys were so confident in their grappling, particularly Lopes enough to the point that he's comfortable fighting off of his back. But it never got to that point. And now Lopes is getting a title shot ahead of the only guy that has beaten him in the UFC in Evloev. Frankly, I feel like Evloev deserves the title shot more than Lopes does, but obviously because Evloev doesn't have a single UFC finish to his name, whereas Lopes is a guy that has seen this meteoric rise and had this big galvanization of momentum around him relative to the fan support. Lopes was probably going to get the title shot here, as these two are now fighting for a vacant belt. I just think it's too much too soon for Lopes. And that concern of him being too confident in his ability to fight off of his back, I think that too many people that are blindly supporting this guy are discounting that and are just overly confident in the fact that Volk is, in their belief that Volk is washed and that Lopes is going to be able to spark him in the same way that that Lopes did to Pat Sabatini and Sadiq Youssef. Alexander Volkanovski is not Sadiq Youssef or Pat Sabatini. This is a guy who swept Max Holloway going away in 2 of their fights. This is one of the most technically sophisticated MMA fighters we've ever seen. And that's not an opinion I would have had about him as a casual fan. I did not like Volk when I started doing this analysis at length, to the point that I was considering just betting the Korean Zombie out of spite for Volk 3 years ago at UFC 273, even though the numbers were telling me that wasn't a good idea. My continued foray into this sport has made me admire the kind of fighter that Volk is, particularly for the size that he's at in the division. I don't know if he's certainly not one of the best athletes overall that we've seen in the UFC, but the guy's in a very unique position, having been a former rugby player up at, the 200-pound realm at 5'6", taking all that weight off of his frame as he's gone further, as he, built himself into an MMA fighter, put him in a position where he has truly phenomenal cardio and is able to put on a pace that, frankly, most fighters just cannot keep up with over the course of 5 rounds. I mean, that last round that he had against Islam Makhachev was simply unbelievable. I mean, the look of stress and sheer panic that was in Makhachev's face down the stretch of that fight, it really felt like Volk was going to have a case for winning, even though I still think that Islam won 3 rounds of that fight. The most impressive round of all was the final round and what Volk did to him still. And yet, in spite of that performance, Volk was very nearly on the wrong end of a line flip as recently as a day or 2 ago, because he got head kicked on short notice against Makhachev, and he got put to sleep against a guy in Topuria that is a hard enough hitter that he was the first guy to knock out Max Holloway and crack his legendary chin. And yet we think a significant share of MMA fans expect Lopes is going to replicate that result because Volk is 36 and because Lopes sparked Pat Sabatini and Sadiq Youssef, one of whom hasn't fought since they competed. I just think it's too much too soon for Lopes. And if the guy's most impressive win, I think you can make a case that Dan Ige on a few hours' notice is a more impressive win than Brian Ortega, given how much time Ortega spent away, how much Rodriguez faded in the fight that Ortega had with him in his return, and how underwhelming of a performance Ortega had overall, where he wasn't able to get any sort of grappling going whatsoever, which is where he needs to be operating in order to have his most success. Volk is too smart and savvy of a fighter, I think, with the amount of preparation that he has had for this, to allow himself to be taken advantage of by Lopes in the same way that Topuria or Makhachev did. And I think that there's something to be said, too, about the difference in success going the distance between these two. I don't think Volk has ever lost a final round of a fight in his MMA career. And that includes all of the 5-round fights that he's been in. He's been in more fights going the distance, period, than Lopes has. And Lopes has multiple split decisions on his record. Even though he's got multiple 5-round fights, too. He's got 2. But none of them have been against Volk-caliber opponents. And this is a guy in Volk who has gone 5 full rounds with not only Max Holloway 3 times, but literally the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world. And some people believe should have been scored the victory over that guy. I don't deny that Lopes has made incredible, significant strides to the point of becoming a championship caliber contender. Championship contender caliber fighter within the last 2 or 3 years. But I'm not willing to put this guy in the same realm as Islam Makhachev or Ilia Topuria. I don't like using the colloquialisms that a lot of other people do in this sport. You know, he got that dog in him is probably the biggest example. But, I mean, if there is one that I can at least understand to a certain extent, it's when people say there are levels to this game. Diego Lopes is not an all-timer in the way that Volkanovski is. And even though I imagine that the end is probably within the next 3 or 4 years for Volk, I don't think it's going to be here. I think Volkanovski is going to do what he has to weather the early storm from Lopes. I think the pace for Lopes is going to decline the way that it did, even in the Ortega fight, because the 3rd round was far from his most impressive in that fight. In the way that it did against Ige, in the way that, I mean, he never really got going against Evloev. His best round in that fight was arguably round 3. But in the fights with Brito and with Evloev, he was too comfortable fighting off of his back. The same thing with the Ige fight. But in both of his last 2 performances, his worst rounds in those fights were the final round, granted after which he had pretty convincingly banked the first 2. But even if he banks the first 2 rounds of this fight, with or without knockdowns, I think Volk is too savvy to not make the in-fight adjustments needed to get a decision win here. So I'm going to say that Volk wins a 48-47 decision in which he lets Lopes deliver the most of what he has to offer over the first 10 minutes. But then he just has Lopes totally lost for the last 15. That Volk totally turns the tide in round 3. Lopes starts getting too desperate, going to his back when he recognizes that he doesn't have the answers that he needs to recapture the momentum, and is just trying to operate where he's been traditionally most comfortable. And Volk is just too savvy in his submission defense to allow himself to be compromised. Or perhaps he doesn't even invite doing a ground and pound and just allows Lopes to return to his feet instead of ever letting that fight get to the ground where Lopes might be able to get some sort of sneaky submission attempt. I would think that Lopes has a little bit more knockout upside here just because of because we haven't really seen a lot of one-punch knockouts from Volk in his UFC run, the way that we've seen Lopes just kind of spark people recently. But at the same time, Lopes has been knocked out twice earlier in his career, well before, I shouldn't say well before Volk was, because Volk got knocked out in round 3 in 2013, but he had been knocked out twice in his MMA career prior to when Volk got knocked out by Makhachev for the first time in the UFC. So I don't think it's out of the question that Volk could get a late KO win himself here if he turns up the pace even earlier than round 3 and is able to overpower and overwhelm Lopes down the stretch. But I think we get a war. I think Volk just ends up putting forth the more technical performance, and I'll say that he gets a 48-47 decision win in which he takes the last 15 minutes. Wouldn't surprise me if he gets going earlier than that. Wouldn't surprise me if Lopes isn't able to get the first round because Volk is just not allowing himself to get caught. But I think Lopes is going to come out guns blazing the way that he has in pretty much all of his other fights and make enough of an early impression that he gets the first round. But short of him getting multiple knockdowns in the first round, I'm not going to be super nervous about Volk's chances of winning this fight unless we get to round 3 and Volk hasn't been able to turn the tide by then, or at least have any sort of moments of success. I don't think this is an easy fight for Volkanovski, but I do think that it is a step down in competition relative to 2 of the last 3 opponents that he's fought. And if Lopes loses, I don't care what happens in the Yair fight. You got to have Lopes fight Yair next in Mexico City. That is the layup matchmaking for the UFC, and I hope to see it happen. But for now, give me Volk to reclaim his title in Miami and cement his status as one of the best MMA fighters ever and win a 48-47 decision over Diego Lopes. And that's going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 314. I know I said I was going to try to be efficient. That didn't necessarily end up being the case. And honestly, I said this was going to publish Thursday night, and as I'm getting done recording this after work on Thursday because I was tired this week and was too... I could have recorded yesterday. Frankly, I was just too lazy and got sidetracked. But yeah, this ended up being an extremely long show, more than I anticipated, but go figure, it's 13 fights. And yeah, I just appreciate all of your patience. Thank you very much for continuing to tune in. It is a labor of love at the end of the day. I wouldn't still be doing this at this point if I didn't genuinely enjoy getting to talk about all of this, and every little bit of praise that I get from you guys, and not just guys, I hope, the degenerates, degeneritas, and degenerati out there, it makes all of the effort worth it in the end. I might do a special show just to say thank you when I do hit 2K, if I do hit 2K followers before the end of my 3-year anniversary at the end of next month. But I will be back before the end of next month to do UFC 315, the Montreal pay-per-view that features the title fight between Bilal Muhammad and Jack Della Maddalena, as well as the flyweight title fight between Manon Fiorot and Chevy Chonks. Probably my favorite women's MMA fighter, period. So that'll be a fun card. But until then, I hope you all enjoy the Miami card. I hope you've all enjoyed sharing in the view once again that I had when the RAXPOD was born in Miami. No FOMO for me missing out on this card. I know there's a lot of cappers and other MMA personalities that have decided to descend on Miami for this event. Thankfully, I was there for UFC 287 only a handful of days after I moved into the apartment with the view that is you're currently looking at. And man, that was to say that I got to see Pereira versus Adesanya and what might end up going down as the last win in Adesanya's career. I mean, I got to see one of the best MMA moments ever, and I'll cherish that for the rest of my life. And yeah, I won't have any FOMO for a pay-per-view again after getting to see that in the front row. So, front row of the stands, not on the floor. Maybe one day I'll get down to the floor for one of these International Fight Week pay-per-views or something. But it would have to be something pretty spectacular. Maybe if Charles fights for a belt again. But I don't know. We'll see. In any event, I've already gone on way too long. As I said, I'm very grateful to all of you for sticking around for this long. Once more, please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube and Twitter if you haven't already. I'll be back for UFC 315. Thanks for bearing with me. Take care, folks, and looking forward to many more fights and events in the near future and beyond. Take care.